is Dan Baker. This is Comrade Meow's Communist Audiobooks, and I'm going to be reading from What is Marxism by Alan Woods and Rob Sewell. Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy. Friedrich Engels, 1886. This is an extract. Men make their own history, whatever its outcome may be, in that each person follows his own consciously desired end, and it is precisely the resultant of these many wills operating in different directions and of their manifold effects upon the outer world that constitutes history. Thus, it is also a question of what the many individuals desire. The will is determined by passion or deliberation, but the levers which immediately determine passion or deliberation are of very different kinds. Partly, they may be external objects, partly ideal motives, ambition, quote, enthusiasm for truth and justice, personal hatred, or even purely individual whims of all kinds. But, on the one hand, we have seen that the many individual wills active in history, for the most part, produced results quite other than those intended, often quite the opposite, that their motives, therefore, in relation to the total result, are likewise of only secondary importance. On the other hand, the further question arises: what driving forces in turn stand behind these motives? What are the historical forces which transform themselves into these motives in the brains of the actors? The old materialism never puts this question to itself. Its conception of history, insofar as it has one at all, is therefore essentially pragmatic. It divides men who act in history into noble and ignoble, and then finds that, as a rule, the noble are defrauded and the ignoble are victorious. Hence, it follows for the old materialism that nothing very edifying is to be got from the study of history, and for us that, in the realm of history, the old materialism becomes untrue to itself, because it takes the ideal driving forces which operate there as ultimate causes, instead of investigating what is behind them. What are the driving forces of these driving forces? This inconsistency does not lie in the fact that ideal driving forces are recognized, but in the investigation not being carried further back, behind these, into their true motive causes. On the other hand, the philosophy of history, particularly as represented by Hegel, recognizes that the ostensible and the also really operating motives of men who act in history are by no means the ultimate causes of historical events, that behind these motives are other motive powers which have to be discovered. But it does not seek these powers in history itself. It imports them, rather from outside, from philosophical ideology into history. Hegel, for example, instead of explaining the history of ancient Greece out of its own interconnections, simply maintains that it is nothing more than the working out of forms of beautiful individuality, the realization of a, quote, work of art as such. He says much in this connection about the old Greeks that is fine and profound, but that does not prevent us today from refusing to be put off with such an explanation, which is a mere manner of speech. When, therefore, it is a question of investigating the driving powers which, consciously or unconsciously, and indeed often very unconsciously, lie behind the motives of men who act in history, and which constitutes the real, ultimate driving forces of history, then it is not a question so much of the motives of single individuals, however eminent, as of those motives which set in motion great masses, whole people, and again whole classes of people in each people. And this too, not merely for an instant, like the transient flaring up of a straw fire which quickly dies down, but as a lasting action resulting in a great historical transformation. To ascertain the driving causes which here in the minds of acting masses and their leaders, to so-called great men, are reflected as conscious motives, clearly or unclearly, directly or in an ideological, even glorified form, is the only path which can put us on the track of the laws holding sway both in history as a whole and at particular periods, and in particular lands. Everything which sets men in motion must go through their minds, but what form it will take in the mind will depend very much upon the circumstances. The workers have by no means become reconciled to capitalist machine industry, even though they no longer simply break the machines to pieces, as they still did in 1848 on the Rhine. From Preface to a Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy by Karl Marx in 1859. In the social production of their life, men enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of their will, relations of production which correspond to a definite stage of development and of their material productive forces. The sum total of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which rises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process in general. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. At a certain stage of their development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or, what is but a legal expression for the same thing, with the property relations within which they have been at work hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an epoch of social revolution. With the change of the economic foundation, the entire immense superstructure is more or less rapidly transformed. In considering such transformations, a distinction should always be made between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of natural science, and the legal, political, religious, ascetic, or philosophic, in short, ideological forms, in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. Just as our opinion of an individual is not based on what he thinks of himself, so can we not judge of such a period of transformation by its own consciousness. On the contrary, this consciousness must be explained rather from the contradictions of material life, from the existing conflict between the social productive forces and the relations of production. No social order ever perishes before all of the productive forces for which there is room in it have developed, and new higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the old society itself. Therefore, mankind always sets itself only such tasks as it can solve, since, looking at the matter more closely, it will always be found that the tasks itself arises only when the material conditions of its solution already exist or are at least in the process of formation. In broad outlines, Asiatic, ancient, feudal, and modern bourgeoisie forms of production can be designated as progressive epochs in the economic formation of society. The bourgeoisie relations of production are the last antagonistic form of the social process of production. Antagonistic not in the sense of individual antagonisms, but of one arising from the social conditions of life of the individuals. At the same time, the productive forces developing in the womb of bourgeois society create the material conditions for the solution of that antagonism. This social formation brings, therefore, the prehistory of society to a close. And here we have some reading questions and recommended reading, which I will practice in my own time. Marxist economics. What is Marxist economics? By Rob Sewell, 2013. The capitalist system is experiencing its worst crisis in living memory, possibly in its history. As a result, there is a renewed interest in understanding the way in which the economic system works, and, above all, Marxist economics. At first glance, Marxist economics may not seem quite difficult to understand. To begin with, the language appears difficult. At first glance, Marxist economics may seem quite difficult to understand. To begin with, the language appears difficult. That is the case with all sciences, which require their own shorthand. However, once you understand the basic principles, it becomes quite straightforward, and the effort is certainly worth it. In fact, the rewards are truly amazing. Marxism will provide answers to many questions that are shrouded in mystery, not least how workers are exploited and why the capitalist system experiences devastating periodic crises. Marx did not look on the economic system from a subjective point of view, but from an objective one. It is the same approach as a natural scientist who examines the workings of a beehive. When you look at the society we live in, everything appears to be dominated by money and the buying and selling of things. Making money is the driving force behind almost everything. Money relations have become burned deep into everyday life and consciousness. Money even becomes personified, while people are viewed in cash terms. Quote, "The pound is doing a bit better today on financial markets," says the Financial News, as if referring to the health of a sick individual. On the other hand, the millionaire landowner Duke of Westminster is said to be, quote, "worth so many millions." What is the reason for this strange state of affairs, which Marx describes as a commodity fetish? Put simply, this bizarre concept is a product of the market economy, where social relations are distorted and reduced to a series of cash payments. As we live in a world dominated by such relationships, they permeate our thinking and view of things. This outlook mystifies, for example, our view of economic activities, of which we are a part. Our daily lives are dominated by mysterious forces. Such things operate behind our backs, and we do not fully understand them. Like primitive people that worshipped inanimate objects, our world is dominated by money and commodities, which acquire seemingly extraordinary powers. No one has control over the market, and yet it dominates everyone. This situation did not always exist. Under feudal society, for instance, social relations were starker and more transparent. They were based on social obligations, which in turn were based on a hierarchy of land ownership. Everyone had and knew their place. Society was socially static, but the capitalists ruthlessly put an end to feudalism and established their own rule. Marx and Engels state in the Communist Manifesto, quote, "The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the mostly feudal ties that bound man to his, quote, natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous, quote, cash payment," end quote. Capitalism revolutionizes the productive forces in comparison to past societies, but brings with it its own laws and contradictions. The rising capitalist class dispossessed the peasants of their land and their independent means of living, turning them into wage laborers. They monopolized the means of production and forced the former serfs, the penniless workers, to work for the new men of property. This new class division was the outcome of the new social order. This is what Marx described as the period of primitive accumulation, whereby capitalism came into being, quote, "dripping from head to foot from every pore with blood and dirt," end quote. Through this brutal process emerged the working class and the newly enriched capitalist class, with their own separate class interests. The capitalists, the dominant class, ruthlessly exploited the workers, from which they derived surplus value, their wealth, and economic power. Every class society developed its own exploiting classes, namely slave owners, feudal landlords, and capitalists. Under slave society, the producers were the property of slave owners. Under feudalism, the land, the most important factor in an agricultural society, to which the serfs were tied, is owned by the feudal lords. Under capitalism, the machines and factories, the means of production, are privately owned by the capitalists, while the propertyless workers are forced to sell themselves, or more correctly their labor power, in order to survive. Where production for exchange has developed a wide range of goods are produced, a division of labor arises. Although production is common to all forms of society, production for exchange is not. In peasant societies, people live off the crops they produce, and exchange plays no role. Under feudalism, the lord simply expropriated the surplus production of the serfs who worked on their lands. Under capitalism, production for exchange becomes the dominant form. To underline the difference between production in general and production for exchange, Marx uses the distinctive terms of use value and exchange value. Our everyday expression value has two senses for Marx. One is use value, which is something that satisfies a human want. It has the quality of being useful. A mobile phone is a use value, in that it is a device that allows us to talk to other phone users. However, a use value need not be a physical thing. Singing has a use value, providing someone with enjoyment. But when finished, nothing tangible remains. Again, not all use values are products of human labor. Air is a use value, as if it cannot be inhaled then people will die. But no labor is involved in its production. However, almost all products of human labor are nevertheless use values. Second is an exchange value, which reflects the value of a commodity when one commodity is exchanged for another. So many pairs of shoes can be exchanged for so many pairs of trousers. A commodity is a thing that is produced for sale. It is a use value that also has an exchange value. Namely, something that can be sold on the market. The seller of commodities is only interested in exchange value. They are interested in the price it will fetch and nothing more. The buyer, on the other hand, is interested in the use value, what use something has, and also how much it costs. The exchange value of a commodity is determined by its value. These dual characteristics of a commodity, use value and exchange value, are intertwined. If a commodity that has been produced has no use to anyone, then nobody will buy it and it cannot be exchanged. In such a situation, the exchange value becomes meaningless. The commodity, therefore, contains useless labor. It was the job of Marx to understand these relationships. Through this understanding, he was able to reveal how the exploitation of the working class under capitalism occurs. He was able to do this by developing the labor theory of value, a theory which was already the cornerstone of the early bourgeois political economists such as Adam Smith and David Ricardo. The basis of this theory is straightforward enough. The primary argument is that labor is the source of all value. Human beings can only live and satisfy their basic needs through labor, the production of use values, the need to work in order to survive. Of course, this can also take the form of an exploiting class living off the labor of others, as under capitalism. Therefore, without labor, we would all perish. Every child knows that any nation that stopped working, not for a year, but let us say just for a few weeks, would perish, wrote Marx. Prior to the development of capitalism, the majority of production was for personal use consumption. Peasants tended their crops and made the things they needed. Any small surpluses were sold at the local market, but this was a secondary thing. However, as the market becomes dominant, most producers create commodities not for themselves, but for others, namely for exchange. Here then lies the embryo of modern capitalist economic relations. Everyone becomes dependent on everyone else due to the social division of labor, because everyone needs the products produced by others. Exchange is the social tie between persons. This is the basis of generalized commodity production. It means the mass production of exchange values. The exchange of commodities is based on an exchange of equivalents. One thing is exchanged for something else of equal value. While some merchants buy cheap and sell dear, this is only a form of swings and roundabouts. One seller's gain is another buyer's loss, and vice versa. Society as a whole does not benefit from this. It merely distributes what is. Nevertheless, from barter onwards, there is a striving to exchange a certain quantity of a product for a certain quantity of another, but based on an exchange of equivalents. Commodities, as we explained, are things that are produced for exchange. The question arises, what is being exchanged exactly? Things are so different and have different uses, so what have they all in common? What allows them to be compared one with another? This common feature is clearly not weight, color, size, or any other physical quality, which all vary considerably between one commodity and another. A pair of shoes is very different from a pair of trousers. In exchange, what they have in common is that they are all products of human labor. Quote, nature does not construct machines, locomotives, railways, electric telegraphs, self-acting mules, etc. These are products of human industry, explained Marx, end quote. Nature provides the materials, but it is labor that fashions them into values. Nature provides us with materials for free, without any value. It is human labor, through the expenditure of time and effort, that serves to create values. As a consequence, through exchange, so much generalized labor in one commodity can be compared with so much generalized labor in another. In exchange, so many watches are traded for so many pairs of shoes, depending on the quantity of labor time involved in their production. Commodities can therefore be regarded in exchange as a certain quantity of condensed labor time. The expenditure of human effort is the real cost involved in production. Even the early bourgeois economists accepted this principle. It was in The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith that Marx first came across the classical definition of value, which he copied down word for word in his notebook. Quote, it was not by gold or by silver, but by labor, that all the wealth of the world was originally purchased, and its value, to those who possess it, is precisely equal to the quantity of labor which it can enable them to purchase or command. End quote. However, Marx developed this idea by discovering that value is in fact a relationship between persons, a social relationship. Under capitalism, this appears in a, quote, fantastic form, as a relation between things. It is people alone, with their own interests, who engage in this exchange, using inanimate objects for sale, not the other way round. Commodities do not take themselves to the market. We must see beyond the appearance of things to understand the real relationships that exist below the surface. The laws that govern capitalism operate behind the backs of society. It is the aim of Marxism, a genuine science, to discover these underlying relationships and laws. The next section is called Socially Necessary Labor Time. For those of you tuning in, please like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment. Value, in the Marxist sense, appears a rather strange thing. It is neither a natural nor physical quality of the commodity. As such, value cannot be seen even with a powerful microscope. Neither can it be touched or smelled, as it has no physical presence. But exchange value, or just value, certainly exists, just like gravity, and is not an arbitrary thing. As Marx explained, value is a definite social quality, and only appears when exchange takes place between commodities. In exchange, a certain quantity of generalized labor changes hands through the exchange of values. In exchange, the work of, say, the tailor or builder are made equivalent. The respective forms of labor are disregarded, and their products are all reduced to generalized simple labor. All labor, whether it is simple, unskilled, semi-skilled, or skilled labor, is reduced in exchange to quantities of average labor, where skilled labor becomes simply a multiple of unskilled labor. As a social relation, value is expressed as a relationship between the labor of the different producers. Value is therefore the result not of a particular form of labor, but of abstract human labor, or labor in general. Capitalists will not sell things at their cost value. They are looking for profit. It is the process of production. In the process of production, labor alone produces value. Machines do not create value, but simply transfer their own value bit by bit to the new commodities through wear or tear or depreciation. Machines, in any case, have to be put to use by workers. Otherwise, standing alone, they produce nothing. Raw materials, likewise, are used up in the process and simply transfer their value to the new products. In other words, a tailor adds new value to the value that is transferred from the materials that he is working on by applying labor through cutting and sewing. The cost of a house, for example, will be made up from the cost of materials needed to build it: bricks, cement, wood, plaster, etc., and the labor of the workers involved. What determines their price? The bricks, wood, cement, etc. were all produced by human labor. Hence, costs can be reduced to quantities of labor time involved in their production. Therefore, prices are determined by the production costs, namely the labor time required to produce them. This is a combination of past and present labor, dead and living labor, as Marx called it. More correctly, the value of a commodity is measured not by labor time as such, but by the amount of socially necessary labor time invested in its production. Marx made this vital distinction between labor time and socially necessary labor time. Value is not simply equal to the amount of labor involved in production, as a lazy or inefficient worker would then be the source of much greater values, having spent much more time in producing things. Clearly, this is false. Value is produced by socially necessary labor, namely the average labor used to produce goods under average social conditions and under the existing level of technique. Whether a commodity contains socially necessary labor or not will be revealed in exchange as commodities are sold or rejected in the marketplace. If it takes longer to produce a certain commodity than the average time, the excess labor time is useless labor. In the market, such high value, quote, overpriced commodities will not find a buyer. All those commodities made at a cost higher than the social average will remain unsold or will have to be sold at a loss by the capitalists. Our capitalists employing unproductive, wasted labor will soon find themselves driven out of business, unable to sell their goods at the going rate. Prices will tend to reflect the socially necessary time spent on production. So I'm going to stop there, and I will now sit and meditate on these ideas while listening to Lenin audiobooks here in just a minute. And I invite you to join me on my daily routine here of meditation, yoga, and martial arts, which we'll be getting to in a few. So I'm going to sit for 30 minutes and listen to Lenin audiobooks, and then I'm going to practice yoga for about 30 minutes, and then martial arts for 35 to 40 minutes ideally.
Government by Lenin from 1905. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the December 2022 edition of Socialism for All. It's an audiobook and discussion of The Revolutionary Army and the Revolutionary Government by Lenin from 1905. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this piece was first published in Proletary number 7, July 10, 1905, published according to the text in Proletary and checked with the manuscript. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Foreign Languages Publishing House, 1962, Moscow, Volume 8, translated by Bernard Isaacs and the late Isidore Lasker, HTML transcription and markup by R. Sambala, and it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive, marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. So, for historical context, 1905 is about 6 months after the first Russian Revolution began. So, mass uprisings across society against Tsarism and protesting all kinds of horrible conditions. So, let's begin. The uprising in Odessa and the sighting of the armored cruiser Potemkin or Potemkin with the revolution marked a further big step forward in the development of the revolutionary movement against the autocracy. Events have confirmed with amazing rapidity the timeliness of the calls to insurrection and to the formation of a provisional revolutionary government, which were addressed to the people by the class-conscious spokesmen of the proletariat as represented by the Third Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. The new outbreak of the revolutionary conflagration throws light on the practical significance of these calls and makes us determine more precisely the tasks of the revolutionary fighters in the present situation in Russia. The armed uprising of the people is maturing and is organizing itself before our very eyes under the impact of the spontaneous course of events. It was not so very long ago that the only manifestation of the people's struggle against the autocracy was revolts, unconscious, unorganized, spontaneous, and sometimes wild outbreaks. But the labor movement, as the movement of the most advanced class, the proletariat, rapidly outgrew this initial stage. The goal-conscious propaganda and agitation carried on by the Social Democrats had their effect. Comment: at this time, social democracy referred to Marxism. Continuing. Disturbances gave way to organized strike struggles and political demonstrations against the autocracy. The brutal military reprisals of the past few years have educated the proletariat and the common people of the towns, and have prepared them for higher forms of revolutionary struggle. The criminal and ignominious war into which the autocracy has plunged the people filled the cup of their endurance to overflowing. The crowds began to offer armed resistance to the Tsarist troops. Real street fighting, barricade battles, started between the people and the troops. Quite recently, the Caucasus, Lodz, Odessa, and Libau have shown us examples of proletarian heroism and popular enthusiasm. The struggle grew into an insurrection. Even the Tsar's troops gradually began to see that they were being made to play the shameful role of executioners of freedom, of henchmen of the police. And the army began to waver. At first, isolated cases of insubordination, outbreaks among reservists, protests from officers, propaganda among the soldiers, refusal of some companies and regiments to shoot at their own brothers, the workers. Then, the siding of part of the army with the uprising. The tremendous significance of the recent events in Odessa lies precisely in the fact that for the first time, an important unit of the armed force of Tsarism, a battleship, has openly gone over to the side of the revolution. The government made frantic efforts and resorted to all possible tricks to conceal this event from the people, to stifle the mutiny of the sailors from the outset, but to no avail. The warships sent against the revolutionary armored cruiser Potemkin refused to fight against their comrades. By spreading throughout Europe the report that the Potemkin had surrendered and that the Tsar had ordered the revolutionary armored cruiser to be sunk, the autocratic government only completed its disgrace in the eyes of the whole world. The squadron has returned to Sevastopol, and the government is hastening to disband the crews and to disarm the warships. Reports are current of wholesale resignations of officers of the Black Sea Fleet. A fresh mutiny broke out on the armored cruiser Georgy Pobednosets, which had surrendered. The sailors are also rising in Libau and in Kronstadt. Clashes with the troops are becoming more frequent. Sailors and workers are fighting the troops on the barricades in Libau. The foreign press reports mutinies on a number of other warships, the Lenin, the Alexander II, and others. The Tsarist government finds itself without a navy. The most that it has been able to achieve so far is to hold back the fleet from actively going over to the side of the revolution. Meanwhile, the armored cruiser Potemkin remains an unconquered territory of the revolution, and whatever its fate may be, the undoubted fact and the point of highest significance is that here we have the attempt to form the nucleus of a revolutionary army. No reprisals, no partial victories over the revolution can diminish the importance of this event. The first step has been taken. The Rubicon has been crossed. The siding of the army with the revolution has impressed itself as a fact upon the whole of Russia and the entire world. The events in the Black Sea Fleet will inevitably be followed by further and still more energetic attempts to form a revolutionary army. It is our task now to give the utmost support to these efforts, to explain to the broadest masses of the proletariat and the peasantry the nationwide significance of a revolutionary army in the struggle for freedom, to assist various units of this army to unfurl the popular banner of freedom, the banner capable of attracting the masses and rallying the forces that will crush the Tsarist autocracy. Outbreaks, demonstrations, street fighting, units of a revolutionary army. Such are the stages in the development of the popular uprising. Now, at last, we have reached the final stage. This does not mean, of course, that the movement in its entirety has advanced to this new and higher stage. No, there is still a good deal of backwardness in the movement. In the Odessa events, there are unmistakable signs of old-time rioting, but it does mean that the advance waves of the elemental flood have already reached the very threshold of the absolutist stronghold. It does mean that the advanced representatives of the popular masses have themselves arrived, not as a result of theoretical reasoning, but under the impact of the growing movement, at new and higher tasks of the struggle, the final struggle against the enemy of the Russian people. The autocracy has done everything to prepare the struggle. For years it has provoked the people to an armed struggle with its troops, and now it is reaping what it sowed. The units of the Revolutionary Army are springing up out of the army itself. The task of these units is to proclaim the insurrection, to give the masses military leadership, as essential in civil war as in any other war, to create strong points for the open mass struggle, to spread the uprising to neighboring districts, to establish complete political freedom, if only at first in a small part of the country, to embark on the revolutionary transformation of the decayed absolutist system, and to give full scope to the revolutionary creative activity of the masses, who participate but little in this activity in time of peace, but who come to the forefront in revolutionary epochs. Only by clearly understanding these new tasks, only by posing them boldly and broadly, can the units of the Revolutionary Army win complete victory and become the strong points of a revolutionary government. And a revolutionary government is as vitally essential at the present stage of the popular uprising as a revolutionary army. The revolutionary army is needed for military struggle and for military leadership of the masses against the remnants of the military forces of the autocracy. The revolutionary army is needed because great historical issues can be resolved only by force, and in modern struggle, the organization of force means military organization. Besides the remnants of the autocracy's military forces, there are the military forces of the neighboring states, for whose support the tottering Russian government is already begging, of which later. The revolutionary government is needed for the political leadership of the masses, at first in that part of the country which has been wrested from Tsarism by the Revolutionary Army, and later in the country at large. The revolutionary government is needed for the immediate launching of the political reforms, for the sake of which the revolution is being made. The establishment of a revolutionary self-government of the people, the convocation of a truly popular and truly constituent assembly, and the introduction of liberties without which there can be no true expression of the people's will. The revolutionary government is necessary for the political unification and the political organization of the insurgent section of the people, which has actually and finally broken away from the autocracy. Of course, that political organization can only be provisional, just as the revolutionary government, which has taken power in the name of the people in order to enforce the will of the people, and to act through the instrumentality of the people, can only be provisional. But this work of organization must start immediately, and it must be indissolubly combined with every successful step of the uprising. For political consolidation and political leadership cannot be delayed for a single moment. Immediate political leadership of the insurgent people is no less essential for the complete victory of the people over Tsarism than the military leadership of its forces. No one who is at all capable of forming a judgment can doubt the eventual outcome of the struggle between the supporters of the autocracy and the masses of the people. Yet, we must not shut our eyes to the fact that the serious struggle is only beginning, that there are great trials in store for us. Quick comment here. In 2022, soon to be 2023, United States, which is, let's say, not doing so well, going through some major crises, people developing this kind of mindset is imperative. And for many of us, it's a huge switch. Myself, I was basically raised to believe that life was about making as much money as you possibly can, whatever that amount may be, and then buying basically as much shit as possible with it. And that was about it. The whole idea of, social struggle and things like that, I mean, it just wasn't really on the table. I was not, in other words, raised by communists. If you were, wonderful, but many of us were not. So breaking out of the mindset of the consumerist paradise, where basically all problems, personal or otherwise, can be solved by more shopping. But breaking out of that mindset is something we absolutely need to do. Our lives and the lives of future generations depend on it. 2008 was just the beginning. The crisis is just going to keep getting worse and worse, and the recovery will just be non-existent. Doom is coming, in other words, unless we act. It's honestly that simple. Continuing. Both the Revolutionary Army and the Revolutionary Government are organisms of so high a type, they demand institutions so complicated and a civic consciousness so developed that it would be a mistake to expect a simple, immediate, and perfect fulfillment of these tasks from the outset. No, we do not expect that. We are able to appreciate the importance of the slow, steady, and often imperceptible work of political education, which Social Democrats have always conducted and will always conduct. But we also must not allow what in the present circumstances would be still more dangerous, a lack of faith in the powers of the people. We must remember what a tremendous educational and organizing power the revolution has. When mighty historical events force the man in the street out of his remote corner, garret, or basement, and make a citizen out of him. Comment, in other words, call for complete and full participation. Months of revolution sometimes educate citizens more quickly and fully than decades of political stagnation. Let's read that again. Months of revolution sometimes educate citizens more quickly and fully than decades of political stagnation. The task of the class-conscious leaders of the revolutionary class is always to march ahead of it in the matter of education, to explain to it the meaning of the new tasks, and to urge it forward towards our great ultimate goal. The failures inevitably involved in our further attempts to form a revolutionary army and a provisional revolutionary government will only teach us to meet these tasks in practice. They will serve to draw the new and fresh forces of the people, now lying dormant, to the work of solving them. To take the military aspect, no social democrat at all familiar with history who has studied Engels, the great expert on this subject, has ever doubted the tremendous importance of military knowledge, of military technique, and of military organization as an instrument which the masses of the people and classes of the people use in resolving great historical conflicts. Social democracy never stooped to playing at military conspiracies. It never gave prominence to military questions until the actual conditions of civil war had arisen. Footnote there, on this subject, see Lenin's The Tasks of the Russian Social Democrats on the untimeliness, at the time 1897, of the question concerning the methods of decisive attack upon Tsarism. In other words, the conditions were not ripe for that yet. However, at this time, several years later, the people were showing that they were clearly ready for that. Back to the main text. But now, all social democrats have advanced the military questions, if not to the first place, at least to one of the first places, and they're putting great stress on studying these questions and bringing them to the knowledge of the masses. The Revolutionary Army must apply the military knowledge and the military means on the practical plane for the determination of the further destiny of the Russian people, for the determination of the most vital and pressing question of freedom. Social democracy has never taken a sentimental view of war. It unreservedly condemns war as a bestial means of settling conflicts in human society. But social democracy knows that so long as society is divided into classes, so long as there is exploitation of man by man, wars are inevitable. This exploitation cannot be destroyed without war, and war is always and everywhere begun by the exploiters themselves, by the ruling and oppressing classes. There are wars and wars. There are adventurous wars, fought to further dynastic interests, to satisfy the appetite of a band of freebooters, or to attain the objects of the knights of capitalist profit. And there is another kind of war, the only war that is legitimate in capitalist society, war against the people's oppressors and enslavers. Only utopians and Philistines can condemn such a war on principle. Only the bourgeois betrayers of freedom can stand aloof from such a war in Russia today, the war for the people's freedom. The proletariat in Russia has started the Great War of Liberation, and it will go on with it, forming units of a revolutionary army, reinforcing the units of the soldiers or sailors that have come over to its side, enlisting the peasants, imbuing the new citizens of Russia, formed and steeled in the fire of civil war with the heroism and enthusiasm of fighters for the freedom and happiness of all mankind. The task of establishing a revolutionary government is as new, as difficult, and as complicated as the task of the military organization of the revolutionary forces. But this task, too, can and must be fulfilled by the people. In this matter, too, every partial failure will lead to an improvement in methods and means, to the consolidation and extension of the results. The Third Congress of the RSDLP outlined in its resolution the general conditions for dealing with this new task. It is now time to consider and prepare the conditions for its practical realization. Our party has a minimum program, a complete program of the changes that are immediately achievable within the framework of the democratic, i.e. bourgeois revolution, and which the proletariat needs in its further struggle for the triumph of the socialist revolution. But this program contains basic demands as well as partial demands that follow from the basic ones or are assumed. In every attempt to establish a provisional revolutionary government, it's important to advance precisely the basic demands in order to show to the whole of the people, even to the most unenlightened masses, in brief formulation, in sharp and clear outline, the aims of this government and its tasks that are of significance to the entire people. There are, in our view, 6 such fundamental points that must become the political banner and the immediate program of any revolutionary government. They should enlist the sympathy of the people for that government and should be regarded as the most urgent task, upon the accomplishment of which the whole revolutionary energy of the people must be concentrated. The 6 points are: 1. A constituent assembly of all the people. 2. Arming of the people. 3. Political freedom. 4. Complete freedom for the oppressed and disfranchised nationalities. 5. The 8-hour day. And 6. Peasant revolutionary committees. Of course, this is only a tentative list representing the headings, the designations, of a series of changes that are required immediately for winning the democratic republic. We do not claim that the list is complete. We merely want to stress the importance of certain basic tasks. The revolutionary government must strive to secure the support of the masses, of the mass of the working class and of the peasantry. Short of doing this, it will not be able to maintain itself. Without the revolutionary activity of the people, it will be a mere nothing, worse than nothing. It is our duty to warn the people against the adventurism of high-sounding but absurd promises, like immediate socialization, which even its advocates do not understand. While at the same time we must propose changes that are really practicable at the present moment and really necessary for strengthening the cause of the revolution. The revolutionary government must rouse the people and organize its revolutionary activity. Complete freedom for the oppressed nationalities, i.e. for the recognition not only of their cultural but of their political self-determination. The introduction of urgent measures for the protection of the working class. The 8-hour day is the first in a series of such measures. And lastly, the guarantee of serious measures without regard for the egoistic interests of the landlords in favor of the mass of the peasantry. Such, in our opinion, are the chief points that every revolutionary government must especially emphasize. We shall not discuss the first 3 points, which are too obvious to require comment, nor shall we discuss the need for practically implementing reforms even in a small territory, one, for instance, that has been wrested from Tsarism. Practical implementation is 1,000 times more important than manifestos, and of course, 1,000 times more difficult. We merely wish to draw attention to the fact that it is necessary now, without delay, to spread by every possible means a correct idea of our general and immediate tasks. We must know how to appeal to the people, in the true sense of the word, not only with a general call to struggle, this suffices in the period preceding the formation of the revolutionary government, but with a direct call for the immediate implementation of the most essential democratic reforms, for their independent realization without delay. The Revolutionary Army and the Revolutionary Government are 2 sides of the same medal. They are 2 institutions equally necessary for the success of the uprising and for the consolidation of its results. They are 2 slogans which must be advanced and explained as the only consistent revolutionary slogans. There are many people today who call themselves Democrats. However, many are called, but few are chosen. There are many spokesmen of the Constitutional Democratic Party, or the Cadets, the major bourgeois party, but in so-called society, in the would-be democratic Zemstvos, there are few true Democrats, men who are sincerely in favor of the complete sovereignty of the people and are capable of waging a life-and-death struggle against the enemies of that sovereignty, the defenders of the Tsarist autocracy. The working class is free of the cowardice, the hypocritical half-heartedness that is characteristic of the bourgeoisie as a class. The working class can and must be fully and consistently democratic. The working class has proved its right to the role of vanguard in the democratic revolution by the blood it has shed on the streets of St. Petersburg, Riga, Lubao, Warsaw, Lodz, Odessa, Baku, and many other cities. It must prove equal to this great role at the present decisive moment too, while never for a moment forgetting their socialist goal, their class and party independence. The class-conscious representatives of the proletariat, the members of the RSDLP, must come forward before the whole of the people with the advanced democratic slogans. For us, for the proletariat, the democratic revolution is only the first step on the road to the complete emancipation of labor from all exploitation, to the great socialist goal. All the more quickly, therefore, must we pass this first stage. All the more decisively must we settle accounts with the enemies of the people's freedom. All the louder must we proclaim the slogans of consistent democracy, a revolutionary army, and a revolutionary government. And that's the end of the audiobook. So what did you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion there. As always, otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful. We don't run ads or sponsorships on this channel, so that support's important. I would make content even if nobody supported, but that support allows me to spend a lot more time on it than I would be able to do without that support. So if you like this channel, thank a patron and consider becoming one. Also, whether you're a patron or not, engagement counts. Like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment. All of that helps YouTube to recommend this content to more people, and this channel has been growing by hundreds every month. We want to see that growth continue. We want to involve more people in this agitation and education process, which we begin online, but which has to spill out into real life eventually. That's where the third piece comes in, organization. Look around in your community, get to know your local left, Make yourself available, network, and get involved in parties, unions, other organizations and projects that advance class struggle in some kind of way. Even if there's nothing going on in your local community, at least supporting something on a countywide or statewide basis, maybe national basis if you have to, but do look in your local area. That is going to anchor all of this in the struggle, and the next time that there is a major moment, you will be better positioned in an organization with actual other people that you know to do something about it, to advance that, again, in your corner of the country. All right, thanks again, and we will see you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the July 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of The Democratic Tasks of the Revolutionary Proletariat by Lenin from 1906. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So, this was first published in Proletary number 4, June 17, 1906, so just a year after the first Russian Revolution, when the Tsar was not yet overthrown and neither was capitalism, but some reforms and concessions were extracted from the Tsarist government. It was published here according to the text in Proletary by the Marxists Internet Archive, marxists.org, thanks as usual to the Marxists Internet Archive for hosting this file. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Foreign Languages Publishing House, 1962, Moscow, Volume 8, translated by Bernard Isaacs and the late Isidore Laster, HTML transcription and markup by B. Baggins, and it is in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive, within the Marxists Internet Archive. So let's get into the audiobook. The Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, as the conscious exponent of the working class movement, aims at the complete liberation of the toiling masses from every form of oppression and exploitation. The achievement of this objective, the abolition of private property and the means of production, and the creation of the socialist society, calls for a very high development of the productive forces of capitalism and a high degree of organization of the working class. The full development of the productive forces in modern bourgeois society, a broad, free, and open class struggle, and the political education, training, and rallying of the masses of the proletariat are inconceivable without political freedom. Therefore, it has always been the aim of the class-conscious proletariat to wage a determined struggle for complete political freedom and the democratic revolution. The proletariat is not alone in setting this task before itself. The bourgeoisie, or capitalist class, also needs political freedom. The enlightened members of the property classes hung out the banner of liberty long ago. The revolutionary intelligentsia, which comes mainly from these classes, has fought heroically for freedom. But the bourgeoisie as a whole is incapable of waging a determined struggle against the autocracy. It fears to lose in this struggle its property, which binds it to the existing order. It fears an all too revolutionary action of the workers, who will not stop at the democratic revolution, but will continue on to aspire to the socialist revolution. It fears a complete break with officialdom, with the bureaucracy, whose interests are bound up by 1,000 ties with the interests of the propertied classes. For this reason, the bourgeois struggle for liberty is notoriously timorous, inconsistent, and half-hearted. One of the tasks of the proletariat is to prod the bourgeoisie on, to raise before the whole people slogans calling for a complete democratic revolution, to start working boldly and independently for the realization of these slogans. In a word, to be the vanguard, to take the lead in the struggle for the liberty of the whole people. In the pursuit of this aim, the Russian Social Democrats have had to fight many a battle against the inconsistency of bourgeois liberalism. Let us recall, for instance, how Mr. Struve began his career, unhampered by the censor, as a political champion of the, quote, liberation of Russia. He made his debut with his preface to the Vita Memorandum, in which he advanced the markedly Shapovian, to use the current political nomenclature, slogan, rights and an authoritative zemstvo. The Social Democratic Party exposed the retrogressive, absurd, and reactionary nature of that slogan. It demanded a definite and uncompromising democratic platform, and itself put forward such a platform as an integral part of its party program. Social democracy had to combat the narrow conception of the aims of democracy, which obtained in its own ranks when the so-called economists did their best to play down these aims, when they advocated the, quote, economic struggle against the employers and the government, and insisted that we must start by winning rights, continue with political agitation, and only then, gradually, it's the theory of stages, pass on to political struggle. Now, the political struggle has become vastly extended. The revolution has spread throughout the land. The mildest liberals have become, quote, extremists. It may therefore seem that historical references to the recent past, such as we have just made, are out of place, with no bearing on the actual turbulent present. But this may seem so only at first glance. To be sure, such slogans as the demand for constituent assembly and for universal, direct, and equal suffrage by secret ballot, right to vote, which the Social Democrats long since and in advance of all presented in their party program, have become common property. They have been adopted by the illegal Osvobojdenia, incorporated in the program of the Osvobojdenia League, turned into Zemstvo slogans, and are now being repeated in every shape and form by the legal press. That Russian bourgeois democracy has made progress in recent years and months cannot be doubted. Bourgeois democracy is learning by experience, is discarding primitive slogans like the Shapovian rights and an authoritative Zemstvo, and is hobbling along behind the revolution. But it is only hobbling along behind. New contradictions between its words and its deeds, between democracy in principle and democracy in realpolitik, are arising in place of the old. For revolutionary developments are making steadily growing demands on democracy. But bourgeois democracy always drags at the tail of events. While adopting more advanced slogans, it always lags behind. It always formulates the slogan several degrees below the level really required in the real revolutionary struggle for real liberty. Indeed, let us take that now current and generally accepted slogan for a constituent assembly on the basis of universal, direct, and equal suffrage by secret ballot. Is that slogan adequate from the standpoint of consistent democracy? Is it adequate in the light of the urgent revolutionary tasks for the present moment? The answer to both these questions can only be in the negative. To be convinced that this is so, one only has to examine carefully our party program, to which our organizations unfortunately do not refer, and which they quote and disseminate all too little. As a happy exception, worthy of the widest emulation, we note the recent reprint of our party program in leaflet form by the Riga, Voronezh, and Moscow committees. The keynote of our program, too, is the demand for a popular constituent assembly. Let us agree, for brevity's sake, to use the word popular as denoting suffrage that is universal, etc. But this slogan does not stand isolated in our program. The context and the addenda and notes prevent any misconstruction on the part of those who are least consistent in the struggle for liberty, or even who struggle against it. It occurs in our program in conjunction with the following other slogans. 1. The overthrow of the Tsarist autocracy. 2. Its replacement by the democratic republic. 3. The sovereignty of the people safeguarded by a democratic constitution, i.e. the concentration of supreme governmental authority entirely in the hands of a legislative assembly composed of representatives of the people and forming a single chamber. Can there be any doubt that every consistent Democrat is obligated to accept all these slogans? Why, the very word Democrat, both by its etymology and by virtue of the political significance it has acquired throughout the history of Europe, denotes an adherent of the sovereignty of the people. It is absurd, therefore, to talk of democracy and in the same breath to reject even a single one of these slogans. But the main contention, the contradiction between the desire of the bourgeoisie to preserve private property at all costs and its desire for liberty, is so profound that spokesmen or followers of the liberal bourgeoisie inevitably find themselves in this ridiculous position. As everyone knows, a very broad liberal party is forming itself in Russia with enormous rapidity, a party which has the adherents of the Osvobojdenia League, of the mass of the Zemstvo people, and of newspapers like Nashi Dni, Syn Otechesva, Ruskiye Vedomosti, etc., etc. This liberal bourgeois party likes to be called the Constitutional Democratic Party. It actual fact, however, as can be seen from the declarations and the program of the illegal Osvobojdenia, it is a monarchist party. It does not want a republic at all. It does not want a unicameral assembly, and it proposes for the upper house indirect and virtually non-universal suffrage, a residence qualification. It is anything but anxious for the supreme governmental authority to pass entirely into the hands of the people, although for window dressing purposes it is very fond of talking about the transfer of power to the people. It does not want the autocracy to be overthrown. It wants only a division of power among 1, the monarchy, 2, the upper house, where the landowners and capitalists will predominate, and 3, the lower house, which alone is to be built on democratic principles. Thus, we have before us the indisputable fact that our, quote, democratic bourgeoisie, even as represented by its most advanced, most educated elements, those least subject to the direct influence of capital, is trailing behind the revolution. This, quote, democratic party fears the sovereignty of the people. While repeating our slogan of a popular constituent assembly, it in fact completely distorts its sense and significance and misleads the people by its use, or rather abuse. What is a popular constituent assembly? It is an assembly which, in the first place, really expresses the will of the people. To this end, we must have universal suffrage in all of its democratic aspects, and a full guarantee of freedom to conduct the election campaign. It is an assembly which, in the second place, really has the power and authority to inaugurate a political order which will ensure the sovereignty of the people. It is clear as daylight that without these two conditions, the assembly can be neither truly popular nor truly constituent. Yet our liberal bourgeois, our constitutional monarchists, whose claim to be democrats is a mockery of the people, do not want real safeguards to ensure either of these conditions. Not only do they fail to ensure in any way complete freedom of election propaganda or the actual transfer of power and authority to the Constituent Assembly, but on the contrary, they seek to make both impossible, since they aim at maintaining the monarchy. The real power and authority is to remain in the hands of Nicholas the Bloody. This means that the dire enemy of the people is to convene the assembly and ensure that the elections will be free and universal. How very democratic. It means that the Constituent Assembly will never have, and according to the idea of the liberal bourgeois, must never have, all power and all authority. It is to be utterly devoid of power, devoid of authority. It is merely to come to terms, to reach an agreement, to arrive at an understanding, to strike a bargain with Nicholas II for the Assembly to be granted a modicum of his royal power. The Constituent Assembly elected by universal suffrage is to differ in no way from a lower house. That is to say, the Constituent Assembly, convened for expressing and executing the will of the people, is designed by the liberal bourgeoisie to constitute, over the will of the people, the will of an upper house, and on top of that, the will of the monarchy, the will of Nicholas. Is it not obvious that in talking, speechifying, and shouting about a popular constituent assembly, the liberal bourgeois, the Osvobojdenia gentry, are actually planning an anti-popular consultative assembly? Instead of emancipating the people, they want to subject the people, by constitutional means, first to the power of the Tsar, monarchism, and secondly, to the power of the organized big bourgeoisie, the upper house. If anyone wishes to dispute this conclusion, let them assert, 1, that there can be a true expression of the popular will in elections without complete freedom of propaganda, and without the actual abolition of all the propaganda privileges of the Tsarist government. Quick comment here, propaganda used to have a more neutral connotation. It just comes from the word to propagate. So propaganda was just leaflets, flyers, whatever. It didn't originally always mean that it was, misleading or have some of those more negative connotations that we have today. So when Lenin's saying trying to run an election without complete freedom of propaganda, basically means that you can't electioneer, that you can't advertise your candidates, etc. And by the same token, the abolition of the propaganda privileges of the Tsarist government means making it an even playing field. You have freedom of propaganda for your people's candidates, and that the Tsarist government doesn't have a heavy hand in making their point. Anyway, point 2, that an assembly of delegates devoid of real power and authority in that these are left in the hands of the Tsar, is not, in effect, a mere consultative body. To make either of these assertions, one must be either a brazen charlatan or a hopeless fool. History proves conclusively that a representative assembly coexisting with a monarchical form of government is an actual fact so long as governmental power remains in the hands of the monarchy, a consultative body which does not bend the will of the monarch to the will of the people, but only conforms the will of the people to the will of the monarch, i.e. divides the power between monarch and people, bargains for a new order, but does not constitute it. History proves conclusively that there can be no such thing as really free elections, that the significance and character of these elections can hardly be brought home to the whole people unless the government that is combating the revolution is replaced by a provisional revolutionary government. Comment, this is eventually what they got in 1917 when the Tsar was deposed in February, and the bourgeoisie was heading up the provisional government, and the various other parties did participate in that provisional revolutionary government through most of 1917, and then the Bolsheviks, seeing an opportunity in the fall, seized it for a socialist revolution. Continuing, granting for a moment the improbable and the impossible, namely that the Tsarist government, having decided to convene a constituent, read consultative, assembly, will give formal guarantees of freedom of propaganda, all the vast advantages and superior facilities for campaigning which accrue from the organized power of the state will nevertheless remain in its hands. These advantages and facilities for propaganda during the elections to the First People's Assembly will be enjoyed by the very ones who have oppressed the people by all the means already in their power, and from whom the people have begun to wrest liberty by force. In a word, we arrive at the very conclusion we reached on the previous occasion, Proletary issue number 3, when we examined this question from another angle. The slogan of a popular constituent assembly, taken by itself separately, is at the present time a slogan of the monarchist bourgeoisie, a slogan calling for a deal between the bourgeoisie and the Tsarist government. Only the overthrow of the Tsarist government and its replacement by a provisional revolutionary government, whose duty it will be to convene the popular constituent assembly, can be the slogan of the revolutionary struggle. Let the proletariat of Russia have no illusions on this score. In the din of the general excitation, it is being deceived by the use of its own slogans. If we fail to match the armed force of the government with the force of an armed people, the Tsarist government is not utterly defeated and replaced by a provisional revolutionary government. Every representative assembly, whatever title, popular, constituent, etc., may be conferred upon it, will in fact be an assembly of representatives of the big bourgeoisie, convened for the purpose of bargaining with the Tsar for a division of power. The more the people's struggle against the Tsar comes to a head, and the greater likelihood there is of a speedy realization of the demand for an assembly of people's representatives, the more closely must the revolutionary proletariat watch the, quote, democratic bourgeoisie. The sooner we gain freedom, the sooner will this ally of the proletariat become its enemy. Two circumstances will serve to cloak this change. One, the vagueness, incompleteness, and non-committal character of the would-be democratic slogans of the bourgeoisie, and two, the endeavor to turn the slogans of the proletariat into mere phrases, to substitute empty promises for real safeguards of liberty and revolution. The workers must now watch the, quote, Democrats with intensified vigilance. The words, popular constituent assembly, will be nothing more than words if, owing to the actual conditions under which the election campaign and the elections themselves are conducted, this assembly fails to express the will of the people, if it lacks the strength independently to establish the new order. The cardinal issue is now shifting from the question of summoning the popular constituent assembly to the question of the method by which it is to be summoned. We are on the eve of decisive events. The proletariat must not pin its faith in general democratic slogans, but must contrapose to them its own proletarian democratic slogans in their full scope. Only a force guided by these slogans can really ensure the complete victory of the revolution. That's the end of the audiobook. So, should be, I think, pretty clear what he's talking about here. This is, of course, 1906, so well before the split in the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party between the Menshevik and Bolshevik factions. remembering also that social democratic at this time was just simply another word for Marxist or socialist. Basically, in today's terms, the Mensheviks and some of the other factions that were not the Bolsheviks were what we would today call radlibs, sockdems, populists, people like that. Bolsheviks, of course, communists or Marxist-Leninists, etc. So what Lenin's talking about here is as the Russian Revolution was proceeding and the new working class and some of the other classes that were struggling for social change coming up against the long-established czarist autocracy, trying to figure out, how do we modernize society with that in the way, and what do we do with czarism, and talking about how the capitalists, of course, were leading the charge because they did need a certain amount of freedom in order to practice and expand capitalism. However, their relatively conservative property interests tied them in many ways to the existing order, and so they needed a certain amount of revolution, but not too much, because what happens in capitalism? Well, they overthrow the feudal order, and then the capitalists start creating the proletariat, the working class, by operating capitalism. And then what? They have to sustain that for as long as they can. Capitalism is based on the exploitation of the proletariat and the proletarianization of the other classes, such as the peasantry, into the proletariat for exploitation. And they have to maintain that. That's where the surplus value comes from for the capitalists. So here in 1906, late stage Tsarism, basically the very early days of capitalism, a lot of feudal practices had been abolished by this point, but not all in practice throughout all the areas of Russia. So, again, basically just stepping out of feudalism at this point. We see the capitalists want a certain amount of freedom to expand capitalism without the monarchy getting in the way. And of course, the working classes want more freedom because they've known nothing but the boot for a very long time. So they are, quote, allied in the struggle against Tsarism, although with very different long-range interests. Capitalists just want to stop the progression and the struggle at the establishing and expansion of capitalism, whereas workers eventually want to take over the means of production and have a socialist revolution. So this puts the capitalists kind of in the middle of the feudal order that they are trying to oppose, and they need the proletariat's help to abolish that, but they don't want to go too far and then get overthrown themselves by the proletariat. And this is, happened throughout Europe during the establishment of capitalism, is once the capitalists abolish the feudal order, they kind of keep those old reactionaries in their back pocket as kind of an anchor, if you will, so that progress doesn't go too far, risking socialism. They want to keep those reactionaries in their back pocket from yesteryear in order to use them against the working class, who they must try to sustain an oppression of, which is basically the basis of capitalism. If they're going to run capitalism, then they have to exploit the proletariat. So this is basically the predicament, and at this point in the revolution, there was the setting up of, a parliament, and there was talk of, was it going to be bicameral, like the U.S., has the House and the Senate. Really, today, we still need to abolish the Senate. That's a separate discussion. But as Lenin's saying, the socialists, the Social Democratic Labor Party, were pushing for a unicameral, single-body legislative assembly with full voting rights, full freedom of election propaganda during election campaigns, etc. They saw these rights as being fundamental to, laying the basis for the future struggle against the bourgeoisie. After the Tsar will have been overthrown, and the bourgeoisie becomes the new boss, if you will, the new ruling class. As scientific socialists, we do have to look down the line in this way. Having studied the progression of history from a materialist basis, we know that that's what's coming next. And so again, trying to lay the groundwork for that struggle. So basically, Lenin here is describing some of the ins and outs of that, and also, of course, counseling the proletariat, don't get too excited when the bourgeoisie is talking about rights and freedoms, because they will limit those rights and freedoms to exactly only what enables them to establish capitalism, and then they will pull them short, and deny them as much as possible to the working class in order to protect their upcoming rule in the capitalist order that they're about to establish. So, it's always a good time to remember that when capitalists talk about freedom and liberty, and when proletarians talk about freedom and liberty, what that means for each of those classes is not to be understood as being the same in terms of the long-range interests. The proletariat wants freedom from exploitation. The capitalists want the freedom to exploit. So workers need to stay wise to this and, yes, get all the freedoms that you can under capitalism, because they will only give you more leeway to struggle against capitalism. This is, of course, assuming that you're doing everything that you possibly can to maximize your rights in that struggle. But, of course, freedom in bourgeois society is not the end of the road for us. We have to look further. All right, and with that, I think I'll end it here. What do you think? Leave a question or comment in the comment section below. We'll continue the discussion there as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening. And thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more, whatever you see fit. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful. And this support has allowed me to spend a lot more time on this channel and to produce many more hours of content than I would have been able to do without that support. So much appreciated. Then, after the content has been produced and uploaded, engagement counts. Like it, share it, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, even if it's just thanks or good video, something like that. All of that encourages YouTube to suggest this content to more and more people. The audience has been expanding by about 500 to 600 subscribers a month, which is great. We want to keep that growing, and we want more and more people to get access to this information in a digestible, understandable way. That's what this is all about, because capitalism is just heading into more and more crises, and we have got to raise the standards of the US left. We have a lot of work to do, not just the US left, but in many countries. So hopefully this material has been helpful for you, and hopefully also there is a decent organization or party in your area that you can join and get involved in the struggle, which is ultimately what counts, not just learning this stuff in an abstract academic way, but applying it in your community in real life. That party or organization may or may not exist yet in your area, but if it doesn't, hopefully you can at least find something on maybe more of the statewide or national scale that you can join and get involved with in some capacity. All right, thanks again, and we will catch you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the July 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Freedom to Criticize and Unity of Action by Lenin from 1906. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. We don't run ads on this channel, and the patron support is important. You can find a link to Patreon in the video description. So this work was first published in Volna, number 22, May 20, 1906, published here according to the Volna text. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1965, Moscow, Volume 10. HTML transcription and markup by R. Symbala, and it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive, Marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this file and thousands of other free Marxist texts. So before we get into the audiobook itself, there's a note here from the Marxists Internet Archive about this work. On May 11, 1906, 300 Russian Social Democratic Labor Party members of the Moskovsky district in St. Petersburg held a meeting to discuss the results of the Unity Congress. The reports were made by Lenin. No record of his report has been preserved, and the Menshevik Don. Towards the close of the meeting, a controversy broke out between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks over whether it was permissible to criticize decisions of the Unity Congress in the press and at public meetings. The Mensheviks, who were doing their utmost to limit the ideological struggle over the Congress decisions, considered an amendment saying that all the Congress decisions should be discussed not only at party meetings, but also in the Social Democratic press and at public meetings. The resolution, including Lenin's amendment, was carried against 39 votes. In reply to Lenin's amendment, the Central Committee, most of whose members were Mensheviks, adopted the resolution which Lenin criticizes in this article. Let's get into the audiobook. The editors have received the following communication signed by the Central Committee of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Quote, In view of the fact that several party organizations have raised the question of the limits within which the decisions of party congresses may be criticized, the Central Committee, bearing in mind that the interests of the Russian proletariat have always demanded the greatest possible unity in the tactics of the RSDLP, and that this unity in the political activities of the various sections of our party is now more necessary than ever, is of the opinion, 1, that in the party press and at party meetings, everybody must be allowed full freedom to express their personal opinions and to advocate their individual views. 2, that at public political meetings, members of the party should refrain from conducting agitation that runs counter to Congress decisions. 3, that no party member should, at such meetings, call for action that runs counter to Congress decisions or propose resolutions that are out of harmony with Congress decisions." Unquote. In examining the substance of this resolution, we see a number of queer points. The resolution says that, quote, at party meetings, quote, full freedom is to be allowed for the expression of personal opinions and for criticism, but at, quote, public meetings, quote, no party member should call for action that runs counter to Congress decisions. But see what comes of this. At party meetings, members of the party have the right to call for action that runs counter to Congress decisions, but at public meetings they are not, quote, allowed full freedom to, quote, express personal opinions. Those who drafted the resolution have a totally wrong conception of the relationship between freedom to criticize within the party and the party's unity of action. Criticism within the limits of the principles of the party program must be quite free. We remind the reader of what Plekhanov said on the subject at the Second Congress of the RSDLP, not only at party meetings, but also at public meetings. Such criticism, or such, quote, agitation, for criticism is inseparable from agitation, cannot be prohibited. The party's political action must be united. No, quote, calls that violate the unity of definite actions can be tolerated, either at public meetings, or at party meetings, or in the party press. Obviously, the Central Committee has defined freedom to criticize inaccurately and too narrowly, and unity of action inaccurately and too broadly. Let us take an example. The Congress decided that the party should take part in the Duma or parliament elections. Taking part in elections is a very definite action. During the elections, as in Baku today, for example, no member of the party anywhere has any right whatever to call upon the people to abstain from voting, nor can, quote, criticism of the decision to take part in the elections be tolerated during this period, for it would, in fact, jeopardize success in the election campaign. Before elections have been announced, however, party members everywhere have a perfect right to criticize the decision to take part in elections. Of course, the application of this principle in practice will sometimes give rise to disputes and misunderstandings, but only on the basis of this principle can all disputes and all misunderstandings be settled honorably for the party. The resolution of the Central Committee, however, creates an impossible situation. The Central Committee's resolution is essentially wrong and runs counter to the party rules. The principle of democratic centralism and autonomy for local party organizations implies universal and full freedom to criticize, so long as this does not disturb the unity of a definite action. It rules out all criticism which disrupts or makes difficult the unity of an action decided on by the party. We think that the Central Committee has made a big mistake by publishing a resolution on this important question without first having discussed it in the party press and by party organizations. Such a discussion would have helped it to avoid the mistakes we have indicated. We call upon all party organizations to discuss this resolution of the Central Committee now and to express a definite opinion on it. And that's the end of the audiobook. What did you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening. And thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. Sign up for as little as $2 a month or more, whatever you see fit. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful, and they've allowed me to spend a lot more time creating content for this channel than I would have been able to do without that support. So thank you. Also, engagement helps once the content's been uploaded. Like it, share it, subscribe it, comment on it, even if it's just thanks or good video. All of that engagement helps to boost the channel and the videos and helps more people to stumble across this content and get educated about socialism. Thanks again, and we will catch you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the April 2021 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Guerrilla Warfare by Vladimir Lenin, originally published in 1906. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting us on Patreon. There's a link to the Patreon in the video description. So, this is Guerrilla Warfare by V.I. Lenin, originally published in Proletary number 5, September 30, 1906, published according to the Proletary text. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1965, Volume 11. Transcription and markup by Brian Baggins. It's in the public domain, Lenin Internet Archive from 2000. Thanks as usual to Marxists Internet Archive at marxists.org for hosting this file and thousands of other Marxist texts for free. Let's get into the audiobook. The question of guerrilla action is one that greatly interests our party and the mass of the workers. We have dealt with this question in passing several times, and we now propose to give the more complete statement of our views that we have promised. Section 1. Let us begin from the beginning. What are the fundamental demands which every Marxist should make of an examination of the question of forms of struggle? In the first place, Marxism differs from all primitive forms of socialism by not binding the movement to any one particular form of struggle. It recognizes the most varied forms of struggle, and it does not concoct them, but only generalizes, organizes, gives conscious expression to those forms of struggle of the revolutionary classes which arise of themselves in the course of the movement. Absolutely hostile to all abstract formulas and to all doctrinaire recipes, Marxism demands an attentive attitude to the mass struggle in progress, which, as the movement develops, as the class consciousness of the masses grows, and as economic and political crises become acute, continually gives rise to new and more varied methods of defense and attack. Marxism therefore positively does not reject any form of struggle. Under no circumstances does Marxism confine itself to the forms of struggle possible and in existence at the given moment only, recognizing as it does that new forms of struggle, unknown to the participants of the given period, inevitably arise as the given social situation changes. In this respect, Marxism learns, if we may so express it, from mass practice, and makes no claim whatsoever to teach the masses forms of struggle invented by systematizers in the seclusion of their studies. We know, Kautsky said, for instance, when examining the forms of social revolution, that the coming crisis will introduce new forms of struggle that we are now unable to foresee. In the second place, Marxism demands an absolutely historical examination of the question of the forms of struggle. To treat this question apart from the concrete historical situation betrays a failure to understand the rudiments of dialectical materialism. At different stages of economic evolution, depending on differences in political, national, cultural, living, and other conditions, different forms of struggle come to the fore and become the principal forms of struggle, and in connection with this, the secondary, auxiliary forms of struggle undergo change in their turn. To attempt to answer yes or no to the question whether any particular means of struggle should be used, without making a detailed examination of the concrete situation of the given movement at the given stage of its development, means completely to abandon the Marxist position. These are the two principal theoretical propositions by which we must be guided. The history of Marxism in Western Europe provides an infinite number of examples corroborating what has been said. European social democracy at the present time regards parliamentarism and the trade union movement as the principal forms of struggle. It recognized insurrection in the past and is quite prepared to recognize it, should conditions change in the future, despite the opinion of bourgeois liberals like the Russian cadets and the Bezaglavtsi. Social democracy in the 70s rejected the general strike as a social panacea, as a means of overthrowing the bourgeoisie at one stroke by non-political means. But social democracy fully recognizes the mass political strike, especially after the experience of Russia in 1905, as one of the methods of struggle essential under certain conditions. Social democracy recognized street barricade fighting in the 40s, rejected it for definite reasons at the end of the 19th century, and expressed complete readiness to revise the latter view and to admit the expediency of barricade fighting after the experience of Moscow. which, in the words of Kay Kautsky, initiated new tactics of barricade fighting. And there is a comment there on the Russian cadets and the Bezaglavtsi. The Bezaglavtsi, a semi-cadet, semi-Menshevik group of the Russian bourgeois intelligentsia, SN Prokopovich, YD Yuskova, VY Bogacharsky, VV Portugalov, VV Kiznyakov, and others, formed in the period of the incipient decline of the 1905 to 1907 revolution. The group derived its name from the political weekly magazine Bez Zaglavia, without a title, published in St. Petersburg in January to May 1906 under the editorship of Prokopovich. Later, the Bezaglavtsi were grouped around the left cadet newspaper Tovarish, Comrade. Under cover of their formal nonpartisanship, the Bezaglavtsi propagated the ideas of bourgeois liberalism and opportunism and supported the revisionists of Russian and international social democracy. Quick comment from S4A, anytime we are dealing with the term social democracy in these early 20th century documents, we are talking about socialism, Marxism, not welfare capitalism, as social democracy came to mean later on. Section 2. Having established the general Marxist propositions, let us turn to the Russian Revolution. Let us recall the historical development of the forms of struggle it produced. First, there were the economic strikes of workers, 1898 to 1900, then the political demonstrations of workers and students, 1901 to 02, peasant revolts, 1902, the beginning of mass political strikes variously combined with demonstrations, Rostov, 1902, the strikes in the summer of 1903, January 9, 1905, the all-Russian political strike accompanied by local cases of barricade fighting, October 1905, mass barricade fighting and armed uprising, 1905 December, the peaceful parliamentary struggle, April to June 1906, partial military revolts, June 1905 to July 1906, and partial peasant revolts, autumn 1905 to autumn 1906. Such is the state of affairs in the autumn of 1906 as concerns forms of struggle in general. The retaliatory form of struggle adopted by the autocracy is the Black Hundred pogrom from Kishinev in the spring of 1903 to Sedlets in the autumn of 1906. All through this period, the organization of Black Hundred pogroms and the beating up of Jews, students, revolutionaries, and class-conscious workers continued to progress and perfect itself, combining the violence of Black Hundred troops with the violence of hired ruffians, going as far as the use of artillery in villages and towns, and merging with punitive expeditions, punitive trains, and so forth. Such is the principal background of the picture. Against this background, there stands out, unquestionably as something partial, secondary, and auxiliary, the phenomenon to the study and assessment of which the present article is devoted. What is this phenomenon? What are its forms? What are its causes? When did it arise and how far has it spread? What is its significance in the general course of the revolution? What is its relation to the struggle of the working class organized and led by social democracy? Such are the questions which we must now proceed to examine after having sketched the general background of the picture. The phenomenon in which we are interested is the armed struggle. It is conducted by individuals and by small groups. Some belong to revolutionary organizations, while others, the majority in certain parts of Russia, do not belong to any revolutionary organization. Armed struggle pursues two different aims, which must be strictly distinguished. In the first place, this struggle aims at assassinating individuals, chiefs, and subordinates in the army and police. In the second place, it aims at the confiscation of monetary funds, both from the government and from private persons. The confiscated funds go partly into the treasury of the party, partly for the special purpose of arming and preparing for an uprising, and partly for the maintenance of persons engaged in the struggle we are describing. The big expropriations, such as the Caucasian, involving over 200,000 rubles, and the Moscow, involving 575,000 rubles, went in fact first and foremost to revolutionary parties. Small expropriations go mostly, and sometimes entirely, to the maintenance of the expropriators. This form of struggle undoubtedly became widely developed and extensive only in 1900, i.e., after the December uprising. The intensification of the political crisis to the point of an armed struggle, and in particular, the intensification of poverty, hunger, and unemployment in town and country, was one of the important causes of the struggle we are describing. This form of struggle was adopted as the preferable and even exclusive form of social struggle by the vagabond elements of the population, the lumpen proletariat, and anarchist groups. Declaration of martial law, mobilization of fresh troops, Black Hundred pogroms, said Letts, and military courts must be regarded as the retaliatory form of struggle adopted by the autocracy. Section 3. The usual appraisal of the struggle we are describing is that it is anarchism, Blanchism, the old terrorism, the acts of individuals isolated from the masses which demoralize the workers, repel wide strata of the population, disorganize the movement, and injure the revolution. Examples in support of this appraisal can easily be found in the events reported every day in the newspapers. But are such examples convincing? In order to test this, let us take a locality where the form of struggle we are examining is most developed, the Lettish territory. This is the way Novoye Vremya, in its issues of September 9 and 12, complains of the activities of the Lettish Social Democrats. The Lettish Social Democratic Labor Party, a section of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, regularly issues its paper in 30,000 copies. The announcement columns publish lists of spies whom it is the duty of every decent person to exterminate. People who assist the police are proclaimed enemies of the revolution, liable to execution, and moreover, to confiscation of property. The public is instructed to give money to the Social Democratic Party only against signed and stamped receipt. In the party's latest report, showing a total income of 48,000 rubles for the year, there figures a sum of 5,600 rubles contributed by the Lebau branch for arms, which was obtained by expropriation. Naturally, Novoye Vremya rages and fumes against this, quote, revolutionary law, against this, quote, terror government. Nobody will be so bold as to call these activities of the Lettish Social Democrats anarchism, Blanchism, or terrorism. But why? Because we have here a clear connection between the new form of struggle and the uprising which broke out in December and which is again brewing. The connection is not so perceptible in the case of Russia as a whole, but it exists. The fact that guerrilla warfare became widespread precisely after December, and its connection with the accentuation not only of the economic crisis, but also of the political crisis, is beyond dispute. The old Russian terrorism was an affair of the intellectual conspirator. Today, as a general rule, guerrilla warfare is waged by the worker combatant, or simply by the unemployed worker. Blanchism and anarchism easily occur to the minds of people who have a weakness for stereotype, but under the circumstances of an uprising, which are so apparent in the Lettish territory, the inappropriateness of such trite labels is only too obvious. The example of the Letts clearly demonstrates how incorrect, unscientific, and unhistorical is the practice so very common among us of analyzing guerrilla warfare without reference to the circumstances of an uprising. These circumstances must be borne in mind. We must reflect on the peculiar features of an intermediate period between big acts of insurrection. We must realize what forms of struggle inevitably arise under such circumstances, and not try to shirk the issue by a collection of words learned by rote, such as are used equally by the cadets and the Novoye Vremyaites: anarchy, robberism, hooliganism. It is said that guerrilla acts disorganize our work. Let us apply this argument to the situation that has existed since December 1905, to the period of Black Hundred pogroms and martial law. What disorganizes the movement more in such a period, the absence of resistance or organized guerrilla warfare? Compare the center of Russia with her western borders, with Poland and the Lettish territory. It is unquestionable that guerrilla warfare is far more widespread and far more developed in the western border regions. And it is equally unquestionable that the revolutionary movement in general, and the social democratic movement in particular, are more disorganized in central Russia than in the western border regions. Of course, it would not enter our heads to conclude from this that the Polish and Lettish social democratic movements are less disorganized thanks to guerrilla warfare. No, The only conclusion that can be drawn is that guerrilla warfare is not to blame for the state of disorganization of the social democratic working class movement in Russia in 1906. Allusion is often made in this respect to the peculiarities of national conditions, but this allusion very clearly betrays the weakness of the current argument. If it is a matter of national conditions, then it is not a matter of anarchism, Blankism, or terrorism, sins that are common to Russia as a whole and even to the Russians especially, but of something else. Analyze this something else concretely, gentlemen. You will then find that national oppression or antagonism explain nothing, because they have always existed in the western border regions, whereas guerrilla warfare has been engendered only by the present historical period. There are many places where there's national oppression and antagonism, but no guerrilla struggle, which sometimes develops where there is no national oppression whatsoever. A concrete analysis of the question will show that it is not a matter of national oppression, but of conditions of insurrection. Guerrilla warfare is an inevitable form of struggle at a time when the mass movement has actually reached the point of an uprising, and when fairly large intervals occur between the big engagements in the Civil War. It is not guerrilla actions which disorganize the movement, but the weakness of a party which is incapable of taking such actions under its control. That is why the anathemas which we Russians usually hurl against guerrilla actions go hand in hand with secret, casual, unorganized guerrilla actions which really do disorganize the party. Being incapable of understanding what historical conditions give rise to this struggle, we are incapable of neutralizing its deleterious aspects. Yet the struggle is going on. It is engendered by powerful economic and political causes. It is not in our power to eliminate these causes or to eliminate this struggle. Our complaints against guerrilla warfare are complaints against our party weakness in the matter of an uprising. What we have said about disorganization also applies to demoralization. It is not guerrilla warfare which demoralizes, but unorganized, irregular, non-party guerrilla acts. We shall not rid ourselves one least bit of this most unquestionable demoralization by condemning and cursing guerrilla actions, for condemnation and curses are absolutely incapable of putting a stop to a phenomenon which has been engendered by profound economic and political causes. It may be objected that if we are incapable of putting a stop to an abnormal and demoralizing phenomenon, this is no reason why the party should adopt abnormal and demoralizing methods of struggle. But such an objection would be a purely bourgeois liberal and not a Marxist objection, because a Marxist cannot regard civil war or guerrilla warfare, which is one of its forms, as abnormal and demoralizing in general. A Marxist bases himself on the class struggle and not social peace. In certain periods of acute economic and political crises, the class struggle ripens into a direct civil war, i.e., into an armed struggle between two sections of the people. In such periods, a Marxist is obliged to take the stand of civil war. Any moral condemnation of civil war would be absolutely impermissible from the standpoint of Marxism. In a period of civil war, the ideal party of the proletariat is a fighting party. This is absolutely incontrovertible. We are quite prepared to grant that it is possible to argue and prove the inexpediency from the standpoint of civil war of particular forms of civil war at any particular moment. We fully admit criticism of diverse forms of civil war from the standpoint of military expediency, and absolutely agree that in this question, it is the social democratic practical workers in each particular locality who must have the final say. But we absolutely demand, in the name of the principles of Marxism, that an analysis of the conditions of civil war should not be evaded by hackneyed and stereotyped talk about anarchism, Blankism, and terrorism, and that senseless methods of guerrilla activity adopted by some organization or other of the Polish Socialist Party at some moment or other should not be used as a bogey when discussing the question of the participation of the Social Democratic Party as such in guerrilla warfare in general. The argument that guerrilla warfare disorganizes the movement must be regarded critically. Every new form of struggle, accompanied as it is by new dangers and new sacrifices, inevitably disorganizes organizations which are unprepared for this new form of struggle. Our old propagandist circles were disorganized by recourse to methods of agitation. Our committees were subsequently disorganized by recourse to demonstrations. Every military action in any war, to a certain extent, disorganizes the ranks of the fighters. But this does not mean that one must not fight. It means that one must learn to fight. That is all. When I see Social Democrats proudly and smugly declaring, "We are not anarchists, thieves, robbers, we are superior to all this, we reject guerrilla warfare," I ask myself, do these people realize what they're saying? Armed clashes and conflicts between the Black Hundred government and the population are taking place all over the country. This is an absolutely inevitable phenomenon at the present stage of development of the revolution. The population is spontaneously and in an organized way, and for that very reason, often in unfortunate and undesirable forms, reacting to this phenomenon also by armed conflicts and attacks. I can understand us refraining from party leadership of this spontaneous struggle in a particular place or at a particular time because of the weakness and unpreparedness of our organization. I realize that this question must be settled by the local practical workers, and that the remolding of weak and unprepared organizations is no easy matter. But when I see a social democratic theoretician or publicist not displaying regret over this unpreparedness, but rather a proud smugness and a self-exalted tendency to repeat phrases learned by rote in early youth about anarchism, Blanchism, and terrorism, I am hurt by this degradation of the most revolutionary doctrine in the world. It is said that guerrilla warfare brings the class-conscious proletarians into close association with degraded, drunken riffraff. That's true, but it only means that the party of the proletariat can never regard guerrilla warfare as the only, or even as the chief, method of struggle. It means that this method must be subordinated to other methods, that it must be commensurate with the chief methods of warfare, and must be ennobled by the enlightening and organizing influence of socialism. And without this latter condition, positively all methods of struggle in bourgeois society bring the proletariat into close association with the various non-proletarian strata above and below it, and if left to the spontaneous course of events, do become frayed, corrupted, and prostituted. Strikes, if left to the spontaneous course of events, become corrupted into alliances, agreements between the workers and the masters against the consumers. Parliament becomes corrupted into a brothel where a gang of bourgeois politicians barter wholesale and retail national freedom, liberalism, democracy, republicanism, anti-clericalism, socialism, and all other wares in demand. A newspaper becomes corrupted into a public pimp, into a means of corrupting the masses, of pandering to the low instincts of the mob, and so on and so forth. Social democracy knows of no universal methods of struggle, such as would shut off the proletariat by a Chinese wall from the strata standing slightly above or slightly below it. At different periods, social democracy applies different methods, always qualifying the choice of them by strictly defined ideological and organizational conditions. At the end of section 3, there is a note there at the end. The Bolshevik Social Democrats are often accused of a frivolous passion for guerrilla actions. It would therefore not be amiss to recall that in the draft resolution on guerrilla action, in Partinia Izvestia number 2, and Lenin's report on the Congress, the section of the Bolsheviks who defend guerrilla actions suggested the following conditions for their recognition. Quote, expropriations of private property were not to be permitted under any circumstances. Expropriations of government property were not to be recommended, but only allowed, provided that they were controlled by the party and their proceeds used for the needs of an uprising. Guerrilla acts in the form of terrorism were to be recommended against brutal government officials and active members of the Black Hundreds, but on condition that 1. The sentiments of the masses be taken into account, 2. The conditions of the working class movement in the given locality be reckoned with, and 3. Care be taken that the forces of the proletariat should not be frittered away. The practical difference between this draft and the resolution which was adopted at the Unity Congress lies exclusively in the fact that expropriations of government property are not allowed. Lenin. End of section 3, start of section 4. The forms of struggle in the Russian Revolution are distinguished by their colossal variety compared with the bourgeois revolutions in Europe. Kautsky partly foretold this in 1902 when he said that the future revolution, with the exception perhaps of Russia, he added, might be not so much a struggle of the people against the government, as a struggle between two sections of the people. In Russia, we undoubtedly see a wider development of this latter struggle than in the bourgeois revolutions in the West. The enemies of our revolution among the people are few in number, but as the struggle grows more acute, they become more and more organized and receive the support of the reactionary strata of the bourgeoisie. It is therefore absolutely natural and inevitable that in such a period of nationwide political strikes, an uprising cannot assume the old form of individual acts restricted to a very short time in a very small area. It is absolutely natural and inevitable that the uprising should assume the higher and more complex form of a prolonged civil war embracing the whole country, i.e., an armed struggle between two sections of the people. Such a war cannot be conceived otherwise than as a series of a few big engagements at comparatively long intervals, and a large number of small encounters during these intervals. That being so, and it undoubtedly is so, the Social Democrats must absolutely make it their duty to create organizations best adapted to lead the masses in these big engagements, and as far as possible, in these small encounters as well. In a period when the class struggle has become accentuated to the point of civil war, Social Democrats must make it their duty not only to participate, but also to play the leading role in this civil war. The Social Democrats must train and prepare their organizations to be really able to act as a belligerent side, which does not miss a single opportunity of inflicting damage on the enemy's forces. This is a difficult task, there is no denying. It cannot be accomplished at once. Just as the whole people are being retrained and are learning to fight in the course of the Civil War, so our organizations must be trained, must be reconstructed in conformity with the lessons of experience to be equal to this task. We have not the slightest intention of foisting on practical workers any artificial form of struggle, or even of deciding from our armchair what part any particular form of guerrilla warfare should play in the general course of the Civil War in Russia. We are far from the thought of regarding a concrete assessment of particular guerrilla actions as indicative of a trend in social democracy, but we do regard it as our duty to help, as far as possible, to arrive at a correct theoretical assessment of the new forms of struggle engendered by practical life. We do regard it as our duty relentlessly to combat stereotypes and prejudices which hamper the class-conscious workers in correctly presenting a new and difficult problem and in correctly approaching its solution. And that is the end of the audiobook, Lenin's Guerrilla Warfare. I'm going to leave this without further comment. I think this was a very interesting document, and we will be doing more on this topic soon. Thanks to our current patrons, whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for a monthly donation as little as $2 or more. Every donation is helpful, encouraging, and appreciated. Of course, more money is more money, so that's appreciated as well. If you have a comment, please leave a comment, even if it's just a great video. All of that helps in the algorithm to help more people to see this content and spread these ideas. Please remember to hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons. We appreciate all of your contributions, and we will catch you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the October 2022 edition of Socialism for All. It's an audiobook and discussion of the attitude of the bourgeois parties and of the Workers' Party to the Duma elections by Lenin from 1906. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this piece was published December 31st, 1906 in Terny Truda, number 2, published here according to that text. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1965, Moscow, Volume 11. HTML transcription and markup by R. Symbala, and it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive. Marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. So let's remember, just for historical context before we start the text, this is from December 1906. What was going on in Russia at this time? Well, basically the first Russian Revolution was 1905 to 1907, And this was a time when the last remnants of Russian feudalism were starting to really give way, break up, and capitalism was emerging through. It was also a time of mass popular revolts and strikes. Workers and peasants were not happy with the system and wanting change. But while the workers were organizing in workers' parties and the peasants were organizing in peasant parties, and of course the bourgeoisie was organizing in bourgeois parties. So there was also a difference of opinion between these different groups about the new Duma or parliament, which was set up as a concession from the Tsar to the, rebelling population. At first, the Duma was just supposed to be an advisory group. Basically, it would be a parliament, but with no binding vote. It would just be, again, sort of advising the Tsar on what to do. Later, this was changed, but so there were different approaches to, how hard to push on this, and basically how to treat these new elections. So anyway, let's pick it up here with Lenin. The papers are full of news about the preparations for the elections. Almost every day we're informed either of a new government interpretation, striking out of the voters list one more category of unreliable citizens, or of new persecutions, prohibitions of meetings, suppression of newspapers, and the arrest of suspected electors or candidates. The Black Hundreds have raised their heads, whooping and hooting more insolently than ever. By the way, the Black Hundreds were arch reactionaries, so monarchists, anti-Semites, similar in practice to what we would consider fascists today. The parties that are objectionable to the government are also preparing for the elections. These parties are confident, and justly confident, that the mass of the voters will have their say, will take advantage of the elections to express their true convictions in spite of all the tricks, pinpricks, and restrictions, great and small, that are directed against the voters. This confidence is based on the fact that the most ferocious persecutions, the most intolerable pinpricks, will at most eliminate hundreds, thousands, let us say tens of thousands of voters throughout Russia. But this will not alter the sentiments and the attitude of the masses towards the government. 10 or 20,000 voters can be struck off the list in St. Petersburg, say, but this will only cause the 150,000 voters in the capital to withdraw into their shells, as it were, to lie low for a time. They will not disappear, however, and their mass sentiment will not change. If it does change, it will not, of course, be in favor of the government. Therefore, unless the electoral law is radically amended, unless all remnants of electoral legality are finally trampled upon, and they still can be further trampled upon by means of systematic arrests of electors, one may expect the very worst from Stolypin, there is still no doubt that the mood of the masses will decide the elections, and the decision will certainly not be in favor of the government and its Black Hundreds. And all non-supporters of the government are placing their hopes in the masses of the voters. But if you examine carefully what this hope in the masses really amounts to, what the attitude of the various parties is towards the masses, you will observe a vast difference between the bourgeois parties and the party of the proletariat. The cadets are at the head of the liberal bourgeois parties. During the elections to the First Duma, they shamefully betrayed the struggle. They refused to take part in the boycott. They themselves went tamely to the elections and drew the raw masses after them. Now they are placing their hopes on the inertness of these masses and on the restrictions which have been imposed on agitation and on the left parties in the conduct of their election campaign. The cadets' hope in the masses is hope in the immaturity and servitude of the masses. He argues as follows: the masses will not understand our program and tactics. They will not go beyond a peaceful and legal, the most peaceful and timid protest, not because they do not wish to, but because they will not be allowed to. They will vote for us, for the lefts have no newspapers, no meetings, no leaflets, no security against arbitrary arrest and persecution. So thinks the cadet, and he proudly raises his eyes to heaven and says, "I thank thee, Lord, that I am not one of those extremists. I am not a revolutionary. I shall be able to adjust myself most obediently and abjectly to any measures. I shall even get my election forms from the peaceful renovators." Hence, the whole of the cadets' election campaign is directed to frightening the masses with the Black Hundred danger and the danger from the extreme left parties, to adapting themselves to the philistinism, cowardice, and flabbiness of the petty bourgeois, and to persuading him that the cadets are the safest, the most modest, the most moderate, and the most well-behaved of people. Now, just a comment here briefly. I'm going to comment more at the end. Does this sound at all familiar? Have you ever heard bourgeois parties behaving like this in elections? Because it sounds super familiar to me. Every day the cadet papers ask their readers, "Are you afraid, Philistine? Rely on us. We're not going to frighten you. We're opposed to violence. We're obedient to the government. Rely on us and we shall do everything for you as far as possible." And behind the backs of the frightened Philistines, the cadets resort to every trick to assure the government of their loyalty, to assure the lefts of their love of liberty, to assure the peaceful renovators of their affinity with their party and their election forms. No enlightenment of the masses, no agitation to rouse the masses, no exposition of consistent democratic slogans, only a haggling for seats behind the backs of the frightened Philistines. Such is the election campaign of all the parties of the liberal bourgeoisie, from the non-party people of Tovarish to the Party of Democratic Reforms. The attitude of the Workers' Party towards the masses is exactly the reverse. The important thing for us is not to get seats in the Duma by means of compromises. On the contrary, those seats are important only because, and insofar as, they can serve to develop the political consciousness of the masses, to raise them to a higher political level, to organize them, not for the sake of Philistine happiness, not for the sake of tranquility, order, and peaceful bourgeois bliss, but for the struggle for the complete emancipation of labor from all exploitation and all oppression. Only for this purpose, and only to the extent that they help us to achieve it, are seats in the Duma and the whole election campaign important for us. The Workers' Party places all its hopes on the masses who are not frightened, not passively submissive, and who do not humbly bear the yoke, but those who are politically conscious, demanding, and militant. The Workers' Party must treat with contempt the usual liberal method of frightening the Philistine with the bogey of the Black Hundred danger. The whole task of the Social Democrats is to make the masses conscious of the real danger, of the actual aims in the struggle of these forces, whose strength lies not in the Duma, which find full expression not in Duma debates, and which will settle the question of Russia's future outside the Duma. The Workers' Party therefore warns the masses against the clandestine election tricks of the cadet bourgeoisie, against its stultifying cry, "Entrust to us, lawyers, professors, and enlightened landlords, the task of combating the Black Hundred danger." The Workers' Party tells the masses, "Trust only your socialist consciousness and your socialist organization. To surrender priority in the struggle and the right to lead it to the liberal bourgeoisie is tantamount to selling the cause of liberty for grandiloquent phrases, for the tawdry brilliance of fashionable and gaudy signboards. No Black Hundred danger in the Duma can be as harmful as the corruption of the minds of the masses who are blindly following the liberal bourgeoisie, its slogans, its candidates, and its policy." Among the masses to whom the Workers' Party is appealing, the strongest numerically are the peasants and various sections of the petty bourgeoisie. They are more determined than the cadets, more honest, and 1,000 times more capable of fighting. But in politics, they are too often led by the cadet windbags. Even now, they're wavering between the militant proletariat and the compromising bourgeoisie. The advocates of blocks with the cadets are not only doing harm to the proletariat and to the whole cause of liberty, they are also prejudicing the development of political consciousness among the urban and rural poor. They are not performing their immediate duty, which is to free these people from the influence of the liberal bourgeoisie. Look at the Trudovics, the quote popular socialists, and the Socialist Revolutionary Party. They too are wavering, and also are mainly occupied with plans for deals with the cadets. The leaders of the Trudovics, having failed to form a party of their own, are multiplying their Duma mistakes tenfold by appealing to the masses to vote for the cadets. Anakin, through newspaper reporters, Gillikin, in Tovarish, etc. This is downright treachery to the cause of the peasant struggle, downright betrayal of the peasants to the liberal landlords, who would rob the peasants by means of a, quote, fair compensation as thoroughly as their forefathers did in 1861. And as for the popular socialists, even the cadets are laughing at them and calling them second reserve cadets, for example, Milyakov and Rech. Their leaders, Anensky and others, also appeal for blocks with the cadets. Their tiny party, which according to Tovarish, a paper which is favorably disposed to them, is weaker even than the Party of Peaceful Plunder, which has only about 2,000 members throughout Russia, is a mere appendage of the cadets. The position of the socialist revolutionaries is also ambiguous, both in the October period and in the period of the First Duma, They concealed the fact that they had split with the Popular Socialists. They continued to collaborate with them and jointly published the same newspapers. Today, they are not conducting any open and independent struggle, are not sufficiently broadly, openly, and sharply attacking the Second Reserve Cadets, are not supplying the masses with adequate data for criticizing that party, and are not making any appraisal in principle of the whole election campaign and all electoral agreements in general. It is the great historical duty of the Workers' Party to help to create an independent political party of the working class. Those who advocate blocs with the cadets hinder the fulfillment of this duty. Another great duty that confronts the Workers' Party is to free the masses of the ruined, poverty-stricken, and doomed urban petty bourgeoisie and peasantry from the influence of the ideas and prejudices of the liberal bourgeoisie. The fulfillment of this duty is also being hindered by those who advocate blocs with the cadets. They are not divorcing the peasants from the liberals, but are strengthening this unnatural alliance, which is fatal to the cause of liberty and to the cause of the proletariat. They are not warning the peasant masses against the liberals' backstairs politics, or rather political intrigue for the distribution of seats in the Duma, but are sanctioning this intrigue by taking part in it. Down with all blocs. The Workers' Party must conduct its election campaign independently, not only in words, but in deeds. It must provide the whole people, and the masses of the proletariat in particular, with a model of courageous and consistent criticism based on principle. Only in that way shall we succeed in rallying the masses for effective participation in the struggle for freedom, and not in the sham liberalism of the cadet betrayers of freedom. That is the end of the audiobook. So, again, there are differences in some of the circumstances, obviously technologically and the extent of reach and development of capitalism between modern-day United States and Russia 116 years ago. That said, there is also a lot that is very similar. The basic class interests are the same, though the size of the classes may be different, etc. We are still basically in the same mode of production, and there is a lot that carries over fairly closely. When you listen to or read a description like this of an election in Tsarist Russia, and immediately a lot stands out about the way the bourgeois party treats the left and the way that they look down upon the masses and count upon the masses being frightened and unable to act on their own and only following the lead of the bourgeois cadets. I mean, is this not exactly how the leading liberal bourgeois party in the United States, the Democrats, treats the left to this very day? Some things really have not changed. So going through this piece, speaking about the cadets, now they are placing their hopes on the inertness of these masses. So the bourgeoisie starts out as, popular freedom fighters when they are leading the fight against feudalism at the very beginning of capitalism, which we were seeing at that time in Russia. But then as soon as the bourgeoisie has its revolution and really starts to make feudalism fade into the background as a conquered power that is in decline, then their new task appears before them as primary, which is the subjugation of the working masses into capitalism, so that they can exploit all of these working masses, get us working for them, proletarianize the population, and have huge numbers of people multiplying their capital, making them richer daily. So that really becomes the new threat. First they were popular freedom fighters, then they need to defend their minoritarian exploitative system, which just overthrew the old minoritarian exploitative system, against their new subject class, the proletariat. So they really don't want this whole democracy thing to go, quote, too far and really involve the masses in a way that would involve the masses being aware of their own material class interests, because they're diametrically opposed to those of the bourgeoisie. At first, there's common cause in fighting against the Tsar and the forces of feudal reaction. But then the bourgeoisie becomes the new oppressor. They have to stop the revolution just in capitalism, and what do? They anchor themselves to reaction to keep things from progressing forward into socialism, because if the masses really had their say in that moment, well, we wouldn't want the bourgeoisie in charge either. We want to be in charge. That's in our interest. So that's what Lenin is saying here, and we'll get to those quotes again. But it's also what Marx and Engels said as early as 1850. It's currently the pinned video at the Socialism for All YouTube channel. It's Marx's address. The title of the video is Marx on Guns, Address to the Central Committee, 1850. But in that, I mean, it's where the under no pretext quote comes from, which is why I titled it that. But he also goes into, the way that the proletariat should organize as the capitalists are setting up their new capitalist government. Basically, remain fierce critics of it, organize separately from it, have spaces that are completely free of bourgeois influence to do our organizing in, set up parallel workers' governments, and eventually, pick your moment for when you can actually abolish the new capitalist government. But this means not getting caught up in it as the bourgeoisie is doing their platitudes and their weak slogans, etc. Don't get caught up in it. So again, the cadets' hope in the masses is hope in their immaturity and servitude. So the cadet argues, well, the masses won't understand our program and tactics. They won't go beyond a peaceful and legal, peaceful and timid protest. Not because they don't want to, but they won't be allowed to. So they're going to vote for us. They're not organized. And the cadet is just saying that they're going to be the, rational centrists, and that's going to attract everybody because after all, these, extreme left parties, they're not organized, etc. If this sounds depressingly similar to the situation that we have today, well, it's in our power to change that. So what do the cadets do? No enlightenment of the masses, no agitation to rouse the masses, no exposition of consistent democratic slogans, just a haggling for seats behind everybody's backs. So is that what you see from liberal bourgeois parties today in their dealings with workers' parties and the left? That's what I see. So again, I think little has changed there. So as Lenin continues, the attitude of the Workers' Party is exactly the reverse. The important thing is not for the socialists to get seats in the parliament by way of compromise. On the contrary, the seats are important only because and insofar as they serve as a tool for developing the political consciousness of the masses. So it's part of the struggle, not just an end in itself that you need to sacrifice all your principles for. Literally the opposite. Only for the purpose of the struggle, specifically the struggle for the complete emancipation of labor from all exploitation and oppression, only to the extent that the seats in the parliament help with that, is the entire election campaign important to socialists. So the Workers' Party is placing its hopes on the workers who aren't submissive to that liberal bourgeoisie, to the fear campaigns about the, quote, bogey of the Black Hundred danger. Not that the Black Hundred danger isn't real or that, the Black Hundreds are good actually, as the contrarians might tell us today, but because the bourgeoisie is not really going to fight those Black Hundreds. It's like today, the Democrats are not an anti-fascist party. They might point out sometimes the fascist things that the Republican Party is doing, and there's real things there which are hugely concerning to any socialist. But they're not an anti-fascist party. They're a fascist collaborating party. And if you actually want an end to that, you need to organize as a socialist, not as a bourgeois-tailing lickspittle that is, as Lenin says, making the stultifying cry, entrust to us, lawyers, professors, and enlightened landlords, the task of combating the Black Hundred danger. So it's really what they need, because if the Democrats were serious, for example, about being an anti-fascist party, as I've said many times, they would align with the left to crush the Republican Party, send it into the dustbin of history. They could do that easily because a lot of what the Republicans stand for and the Democrats stand for is not very popular. So if they were to ally with the left and do hugely popular reforms that large swaths of the country are clamoring for, then they could defeat easily, handily, whoever was opposing that change, as both parties are opposing right now. And then we could send these big bad Republicans packing and we would never have to deal with them again. But that's not what the Democrats do. Why? Because once the Republicans are gone, the left would be the competitor to the Democrats, former ally in that fight, but then a competitor. And the people behind the Democratic Party who own and control it, who incidentally also own and control the Republican Party, they need that political dialogue and the political fight to stay centered between the Republicans and Democrats so that nothing ever changes. if one of these parties was out of the mix, the left would be able to actually rally the working masses of the country against whoever was left, and that would be a real fight. And the real fight is what the very rich capitalists in charge really do not want emerging. So as Lenin said, the advocates of blocks with the cadets are not only doing harm to the proletariat and to the whole cause of liberty, they're also prejudicing the development of political consciousness among the urban and rural poor. They're not performing their immediate duty, which is to free these people from the influence of the liberal bourgeoisie. So we need to get people away from the Democratic Party in, our current situation in the United States. This is why I advocate for a Dem exit followed by a left coalition. It seems like most of the left parties, it's fragmented. Many of the Marxist parties are revisionist, and then a lot of the parties aren't Marxist at all. Together, I do believe that we could do something as a left coalition, as there is overwhelming support for many policy positions which are opposed by both Democrats and Republicans. And you see this, whether it's Occupy Wall Street or the Bernie Sanders 2 campaigns. I think we need to do the Bernie Sanders thing, but outside the Democratic Party. That would get the left growing. And from there, yes, I realize Bernie Sanders was not a communist, etc. That's not the point. The point is get people developing their political consciousness again by getting some struggle going again. Because, okay, you're here listening to Socialism for All on YouTube, and you're listening to some Lenin audiobooks. The overwhelming majority of the population is not. The overwhelming majority of the population is never going to be communist. They're going to be working people who have some degree of awareness of their own interests, and that's on a spectrum from 0 to 100. Most people are somewhere in the middle as far as correctly identifying their interests. We communists, it's our job to get organized and to exert the best influence that we can on the masses and to lead them in their struggle. I mean, we're also working people and our struggle collectively. But my point is, it's not exclusively a communist struggle in the sense that the overwhelming majority of the population is not going to be communist, especially not overnight. That said, they can participate in their own liberation without, listening to and deeply analyzing, Capital Volume 3 or something like that. Most people are not going to make it to that level of education, the sort of inner circle of the party, things like that. But that said, people can become a lot more aware of this stuff. And some of that happens through book learning and discussion groups. Some of it happens through direct participation in the struggle. To the extent that the struggle isn't even happening, that consciousness is not being sharpened at nearly the rate that it could be. So that's what we want to see, is more of that. And right now, the Democrats have done such a good job of pouring cold water on the entire struggle, and just really every time that the flame gets sparked, of dousing it and extinguishing it. And we need to really fight against that, and that means keeping separate from that group, because that's all they're going to do. So taking the example of the popular socialists, their leaders also appeal for blocks with the cadets, but their tiny party, which only has about 2,000 members, is a mere appendage of the cadets, and the cadets laugh at them. This reminds me of CPUSA's #VoteAgainstFascism campaign. It's fucking irrelevant. You don't need anybody else telling you to vote for Democrats. Literally, we're already blanketed with those messages in the first place. The entire point of being a communist, yes, we want to strive for the best conditions for class struggle that we can have, but it's incredibly far behind the times and the consciousness of the masses in 2022, who have already largely rejected the Democratic Party, to be going for that. You're literally just fighting for a past moment that is no longer relevant. People are ready for much more action than that, but what they're lacking is the leadership and the clear calls for moving forward in that future. So finishing this out, it's the great historical duty of the Workers' Party to help to create an independent political party of the working class. Those who advocate blocks with the cadets hinder the fulfillment of this duty, because again, you wind up just becoming an appendage, a tail. You really don't want that. So Lenin says, down with all blocks. The Workers' Party must conduct its election campaign independently, not only in words, but in deeds. It must provide the whole people, and the proletariat in particular, with a model of courageous and consistent criticism based on principle. So you can't do this lesser evilism shit in either direction. We need a party for workers that actually fights for workers. And as we know in capitalism, the interests of the bourgeoisie, the rich capitalists, and the proletariat are diametrically opposed. So there's really nothing in common here, and we have to struggle against them, not do lesser evilism. That's not how this works. Lenin concludes, only in that way shall we succeed in rallying the masses for effective participation in the struggle for freedom, and not in the sham liberalism of the cadet betrayers of freedom. So you want to do revisionism, you want to be a liberal, go be a fucking Democrat. But leave that shit outside of the socialist universe. Now within that world of the left, of people who've actually made it over to the left and abandoned the Democratic Party, I would say that's mostly people from the Greens on over, and there's many other parties, including Marxist parties there as well. I do believe that we need to come together. This is such a numerically large population in the United States that all of these little parties have not been able to come together in a way that's able to rally the tens of millions of people that we really need to penetrate national consciousness and really get a movement going. We saw Bernie Sanders do it, but he funneled it into the Democratic Party, where again it got extinguished, just really pissed away. AOC did the exact same thing. I mean, AOC was pretty much a Democrat from day one. Bernie Sanders was independent for decades, at least nominally independent prior to that, and had somewhat different politics from the Democratic Party. But in the end, he hitched his wagon, and everybody who was in it, all that money, time, and energy, he hitched it to the Democrats, who Joe Biden's in office, and it's giving me like Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush vibes. Things are not the way that they need to be. We need radical change. Capitalism is going into a gigantic period of instability right now. We had the dot-com bubble around 2000 in the late 90s. We had the housing and mortgage fraud bubble in the 2000s, leading to the 2008 global economic meltdown. Now we have an everything bubble mounting, and when it pops, I mean, this system is in its death throes. The rate of profit is lower than ever. Things that aren't profitable, capitalists don't want to do. And so we're getting into a system where just nobody's needs are being met, and people are just being squeezed and squeezed. We desperately need leadership and organization independent of the system to fight for a new world that will actually give us a future. Tying your wagon to the Democratic Party is tying your wagon to a ship that is going over the edge of a waterfall onto certain death below. You know, and some people who are just so afraid of the Republicans or whatever, and granted, they're not a pleasant bunch. I don't like the Republicans. I would never support them either, ever. They are, though, not looking at this situation from a systemic historical perspective. We need to be making preparations for socialism, not fighting for crumbs aboard a ship that is, again, about to go over the edge. It's going to be hard in this fight, and we're already having massive austerity imposed on us, and there's more coming no matter who you vote for. So what do? We build workers' parties and coalitions of parties working together, which are able to lay the groundwork for workers to separate out from this and to start planning a new future beyond the imminent end of capitalism. The alternative, if we do not do this, if we leave it in the hands of the capitalists, is misery, horror, and ruin beyond your wildest imagination. Literally, we're just getting started with that world. Let's end it at the very first opportunity, but that requires getting organized fast so that when those opportunities come up, we can make the absolute most of them. And again, as far as winning seats in elections, as Lenin said, the only point of that under capitalism is just in service of the struggle to sharpen political consciousness, etc. It's not the way that we're going to do this. So when I say build the parties, build the coalitions, it doesn't mean winning elections. It means building a party. It means networking with people. It means getting the ideas going. It means building a shared vision of what is going to happen next at our first opportunity. Again, we're in a pre-revolutionary period right here, and we need to be ready when those revolutionary moments pop up. Democratic Party, you just can't do that kind of organizing. It's a bourgeois space full of bourgeois influence, and we need our own space that we can actually do this kind of preparation for massive, radical, militant class struggle. So seek out those spaces because nothing else is really going to cut it in the upcoming catastrophes as capitalism goes into more and more crises. All right, I'm going to leave it there. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks to the patrons. Patreon.com/socialismforall if you'd like to get your name on the screen as theirs are right now. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more. It can be recurring or not. Obviously, anything is good and encouraging and helpful. The recurring also helps me to plan this from month to month. I would make content even if nobody paid, but the support lets me spend a lot more time on it, and so you get better both quality and quantity of content up here on the channel. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and comment. All of that is going to help YouTube to recommend this content to more people, so more people are going to see it, and we need to use every tool at our disposal right now in preparing for the fight. All right, thanks again for listening, and we'll see you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the April 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of On the Question of a Nationwide Revolution by Lenin from 1907. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and we don't run any ads on this channel, so consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this was originally published in Proletary number 16, May 2, 1907, and published here according to the Proletary text. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Foreign Languages Publishing House, 1962, Moscow, Volume 12. HTML transcription and markup by R. Cimbala, and it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive at marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. Please go support and volunteer for them if you can. So just by way of background, 1907 was over a year after the first Russian Revolution in 1905. This revolution did not succeed at deposing the Tsar or capitalism, but it did extract concessions, reforms, from the Tsar. The Tsar would later be overthrown in February 1917, and then just a few months later that year, October 1917, the Bolsheviks would lead the working class against the provisional government, the bourgeois government. So this is still pretty early in the process, 1907, but after the first Russian Revolution. Let's get into the text. In a certain sense of the word, it is only a nationwide revolution that can be victorious. This is true in the sense that the unity of the overwhelming majority of the population in the struggle for the demands of that revolution is essential for victory to be won. This overwhelming majority must consist either entirely of one class or of different classes that have certain aims in common. It is also true, of course, that the present Russian Revolution can be victorious only if it is nationwide in that specific sense of the word that the conscious participation of the overwhelming majority of the population in the struggle is essential for victory to be won. That, however, is the limit of the conventional truthfulness of the catchword of a nationwide revolution. No further conclusions can be drawn from this concept, which is nothing but a truism. Only an overwhelming majority can be victorious over an organized and dominant minority. For this reason, it is fundamentally incorrect and profoundly un-Marxist to apply it as a general formula, as a model, a criterion of tactics. The concept of a nationwide revolution should tell the Marxist of the need for a precise analysis of those varied interests of different classes that coincide in certain definite, limited common aims. Under no circumstances must this concept serve to conceal or overshadow the study of the class struggle in the course of any revolution. Such use of the concept of nationwide revolution amounts to a complete rejection of Marxism and a return to the vulgar phraseology of the petty bourgeois Democrats or petty bourgeois socialists. This truth is frequently forgotten by our social democratic right wing. Still more frequently do they forget that class relations in a revolution change with the progress of that revolution. All real revolutionary progress means drawing broader masses into the movement. Consequently, a greater consciousness of class interests. Consequently, more clearly defined political party groupings, and more precise outlines of the class physiognomy of the various parties. Consequently, greater replacement of general, abstract, unclear political and economic demands that are vague in their abstractness by the varying, concrete, clearly defined demands of the different classes. For instance, the Russian bourgeois revolution, like any other bourgeois revolution, inevitably begins under the common slogans of political liberty and popular interests. Only in the course of the struggle, the concrete meanings of these slogans become clear to the masses and to the different classes, only to the extent that a practical attempt is made to implement that liberty, to give a definite content even to such a hollow-sounding word as democracy. Prior to the bourgeois revolution, and at its onset, all speak in the name of democracy, the proletariat and the peasantry, together with urban petty bourgeois elements, and the liberal bourgeoisie together with the liberal landlords. It is only in the course of the class struggle, only in the course of a more or less lengthy historical development of the revolution, that the different understanding of this democracy by the different classes is revealed. And what's more, the deep gulf between the interests of the different classes is revealed in their demands for different economic and political measures, in the name of one and the same, democracy. Only in the course of the struggle, only as the revolution develops, is it revealed that one democratic class or stratum does not want to go, or cannot go, as far as another. That while, quote, common, or allegedly common, objectives are being achieved, fierce skirmishes develop around the method by which they are to be achieved. For example, on the degree, extent, or consistency of freedom and power of the people, or the manner in which land is to be transferred to the peasantry, etc. We have had to recall all these forgotten truths so as to enable the reader to understand the dispute that recently took place between two newspapers. This is what one of them, Narodnaya Gazeta, wrote against the other, Nasha Echo. Quote, "The grouping of the population by party," wrote Nasha Echo, "that important political lesson and the revolution's most important political acquisition at the time of the elections to the Second Duma, showed clearly by nationwide facts that broad strata of the landlords and bourgeoisie are swinging to the right. Quite true. But the mood and the mandates which the left deputies, socialist revolutionaries, Trudovics, and popular socialists have brought with them from their localities also, quote, showed clearly on a nationwide scale that the people are at present steeped in cadet constitutional illusions to a considerable degree, that the people place excessive hopes on the independent activities of the Duma, that they're excessively concerned with saving the Duma. Comment, what is the Duma? So, out of the 1905 revolution against the Tsar, which was not complete, the Tsar stayed in power, but it was a very big, successful, meaningful uprising. A number of concessions and reforms were extracted. One of them was the founding of a parliament. This was the Duma. So it was more than merely advisory, but there were huge checks on what it could do, and the Tsar still retained an enormous amount of power. The Marxists at times ran candidates for seats in the Duma, and at other times boycotted it, depending on the situation. You can find other writings from Lenin about that. Anyway, continuing. That is the obvious fact that the Nasha Echo writers failed to notice. They did notice whom the people sent to the Duma, but not what they were sent there for. But in that case, will Nasha Echo not agree that, in proposing that the proletariat ignore nationwide tasks, it is proposing that it isolate itself not only from bourgeois society, but also from the petty bourgeois people, unquote. This is an extremely instructive and noteworthy tirade which conceals three major opportunist errors. First, the results of the elections are contrasted with the mood of the deputies, which is substituting the deputies' mood for that of the people, and reverting from the more profound, extensive, and basic to the shallower, narrower, and derivative. Footnote here. As far as, quote, mandates are concerned, we reject that argument completely. Who makes account of revolutionary and opportunist instructions and mandates? Who does not know how many newspapers have been suppressed for publishing revolutionary instructions? From Lenin, back to the text. Secondly, the question of a firm and sustained political line and tactics for the proletariat is replaced by the question of an assessment of some mood or another. Thirdly, and this is most important, for the sake of the vulgarly democratic fetish of a, quote, nationwide revolution, the proletariat is scared with the bogey of, quote, isolation from the, quote, petty bourgeois people. We shall deal with the first two errors as briefly as possible. The elections affected the masses and showed not only their fleeting mood, but their profound interests. It is altogether unworthy of Marxists to revert from class interests, expressed by the party grouping at the elections, to a fleeting mood. The mood of the deputies may be one of gloom, while the economic interests of the masses may call forth a mass struggle. An assessment of mood, therefore, may be necessary to determine the moment for some action, step, appeal, etc., but certainly not to determine proletarian tactics. To argue differently would mean replacing sustained proletarian tactics by unprincipled dependence on mood. And all the time, the point at issue was that of a line, and had nothing to do with a moment. Whether or not the proletariat has at present recovered, and Narodnaya Gazeta does not think so, is of importance in deciding the moment for action, but not in determining the tactical line of action of the working class. The third error is the most profound and the most important, the fear of isolating the Social Democrats or the proletariat, which is the same thing, from the petty bourgeois people. That is really a most improper fear. Social democracy must isolate itself from the petty bourgeois people inasmuch as the socialist revolutionaries, Trudovics and popular socialists, are really trailing along in the wake of the constitutional democrats. And that is happening, and indeed has happened very frequently, beginning with the voting for Golovin and continuing with the famous tactics of sepulchral silence, etc. For there must be one of two things. Either the vacillation of the petty bourgeoisie is, in general, an indication of the shaky nature of the petty bourgeois and the difficult and arduous development of the revolution, but does not signify that it has ended or that its forces are exhausted, which is our opinion. Then, by isolating itself from all and every vacillation and wavering in petty bourgeois people, the Social Democratic Parliament educates them for the struggle, trains them in preparation for the struggle, and develops their political consciousness, determination, firmness, etc. Or else, the wavering of the petty bourgeois people means the finale of the present bourgeois revolution. We believe such a view to be wrong, and none of the Social Democrats have directly and openly defended it, although extreme right-wing Social Democrats are undoubtedly inclined to do so. Then again, the Social Democratic Parliament must also isolate itself from the wavering or treachery of the petty bourgeoisie in order to educate the working class masses in class consciousness and prepare them for a more planned, firm, and decisive participation in the next revolution. In both cases, and in all cases, the Social Democratic proletariat must isolate itself from the petty bourgeois people, which is steeped in cadet illusions. The cadets were the main bourgeois party, and do so unconditionally. The proletariat must in all cases pursue the firm, sustained policy of a truly revolutionary class, without allowing itself to be flustered by any reactionary or Philistine cock and bull stories, whether these are about nationwide tasks in general or about a nationwide revolution. It is possible that, given a certain combination of forces or a concurrence of unfavorable conditions, the overwhelming part of the bourgeois and petty bourgeois strata may be infected, for the time being, with servility, slavishness, or cowardice. That would be nationwide cowardice, and the Social Democratic proletariat isolates itself from it in the interests of the working class movement as a whole. So that's the end of the audiobook, and as usual, Lenin has done it again, or did it again, back in 1907.
So that's it for today. This has been my daily routine of meditation, yoga, and martial arts solo drills. And I would like to encourage you to develop your own daily routine of studying, reading, listening to ideology, and practicing your body, sitting in meditation, doing yoga, and martial arts. Please like, share, and subscribe. I'm Dan Baker. I'm a combat veteran of the YPG International, and I'm a sympathizer of the Revolutionary Communists of America, which I believe is the best communist party in the United States and all over the world, as the Revolutionary Communist International. So please join and have a good day.